If it happens, good call.
We'd like to start.
Okay, we'd like to start. Whenever you give us the go.
Let me have your shoe. Hello? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and welcome myself to Brooklyn Borough Hall in this beautiful room. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's public hearing of the 2019 New York City Charter Revision Commission. I'm Gail Benjamin, the chair of the commission. I'm joined by the following commission members. Seated below is Jim Karras, Satish Nuri, and Lisette Camillo. Seated above, starting on my far right, not meaningful, is Sal. Paula Garvin, my counsel, David Seitzer, myself, and Steve Fiella. Sorry. With these commission members, we are going to start the meeting. Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to, if you have a cell phone with you, to put it on vibrate or on airplane mode. Thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to, our hearing, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Charter, which is the city's foundational governing document. It plays a vitally important role in establishing the structures and processes of city government, which in turn affect many aspects of our everyday life. It has been our task to evaluate how the current charter has performed and to identify areas in which improvements might be made in order to best serve the city for the next 30 years. After our first round of borough hearings in September, as well as through engagement online and in person, we received hundreds of suggestions for changes. The Commission ultimately adopted a set of focus areas which outlined those areas which we decided to pursue further, and then held a series of expert forums at which we were able to hear from a wide variety of people knowledgeable in those areas. Following that months-long process, the Commission staff issued a preliminary staff report containing recommendations regarding those proposals which they felt had particular merit for further consideration and for the voters on the ballot this November. The staff report is what brings us here today. We look forward to hearing your comments about the staff report and any recommendations in the report that you support or oppose. Following testimony from the public, we'll have some time to open the floor to the commissioners so that we can discuss with each other the ideas and recommendations that have been raised. We will now begin the public testimony. If you wish to testify and have not already done so, please fill out a speaker slip and submit it to one of our staff. When you are called to speak, we will also accept any written testimony you may have. We will limit testimony to 3 minutes per individual in order to ensure that we can hear from everyone who wishes to speak. After you speak, members of the commission may have questions for you to follow up on your ideas. In order to hear from everybody, I would also request that hisses, boos, cheers not be done in this hall. If you particularly agree with someone, jazz hands are great. I know everybody wants to be cordial and polite, so if you disagree, I think you can just do that in a not verbal manner. I will now call the first 4 people to speak. Alicia Boyd, Robert C. Dorff, Wendy Dorff, and John Manning. Ms. Boyd, if you'd like to begin.
The City Charter Commission is now proposing to add just one more hearing to the ULIP process to compensate for the developers getting a shot at having their application streamlined before certification. It isn't surprising that the real estate industry, being represented here by the Department of City Planner, former Carl Weisberg, will be the only ones benefiting from the so-called Transparency and Community Input Initiative. As an example, please look at the billboards that are now being displayed in front of you. This is the information that was presented throughout the entire ULIP process of the Cornell Realty rezoning application, where an individual developer was able to break a community plan that was created to protect the community and the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. At each ULIP hearing, this information was presented, letters written, affidavits signed, evidence presented, and at each stage of the process, this information was completely ignored. Not one decision-making body considered the community's opposition, addressed the evidence that was produced, or made a statement that they were considered in their determination. Now, in your brilliance, you believe that adding one more hearing for the community will be that for the community to be ignored, for the community to be put in handcuffs and arrested, is the answer to the fact that all over New York City, communities have consistently stated that the ULIP process is a sham. We have already filed a lawsuit against Councilwoman Lori Cumbo, Majority Leader, for her agreement to approve this plan based upon an agreement that took us 4 months to get, where she stated she had performed a miracle in getting the developer to sell 1,000 square feet for $1.6 million to a nonprofit organization to create affordable housing at 100% AMI, which is $104,000 for a family of 4 in a community where our AMI is $40,000. The creation of this affordable housing is actually the creation of severe rent burden apartments for the existing population, which means that over 50% of one's income is needed to be able to afford these apartments. How about this commission actually doing something that will make a difference? Insist that the MIH program change their parameters and create a provision where they will not be allowed to create rent burden or severe rent burden apartments in a community that they plan on building the affordable units. Now that probably will take a miracle, but definitely it will have an impact on gentrification and displacement. Thirdly, adding the gentrification and displacement to an environmental review without any power to ensure that the developers or the city will not be allowed to create those market pressured means absolutely nothing. Again, simply smoke and mirrors. Finally, it will be helpful to have the community board members who actually represent the community be voted on, or a petition drive demanded for their appointment. But then again, we can't see that happening as long as borough presidents are now asking for more power over the ULIP process. The money is being given to the decision makers, the City Planning Commission, the City Council, and the mayor. By adding one more power to the borough president, it just means another hand the developers have to pay. So again, I don't see that flying either.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, if you could just, Mr. Dorff?
I'm here to recall for you one of the most tragic and destructive moments in the history of our city, and I'm referring to what happened on 9/11. On that day, I was in the Brooklyn courthouse working, and I saw what began as smoke and ended in the destruction of the World Trade Center. Later, my wife, who's seated to my left, and myself began to participate in mapping using radar and LiDAR technology to map what was destroyed and what was left of the World Trade Center site. That experience introduced me to what is called geographic information system technology. I was a criminal lawyer. I became a judge for the United States dealing with Social Security disability, but I have always, through the years, concerned myself with the development of GIS, Geographical Information System technology. Why? Because our safety, our security will be hinging on the development of this technology. You may or may not have heard of it, but what it will do is that it will detect explosions, gas explosions, electrical outages, and it will prevent those occurrences in the future, and it will save lives. Now, in order for this technology to be useful and to work, we need to create an underground infrastructure database, and the way it's being done, or the way we propose for it to be done, is through an organization called GISMO, which is a Geographical Information System Technology think tank, and of course through the Department of Information, the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications. What I am proposing to move this technology forward in the city for our security, our safety, is that a committee be created for the Department of the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications, with the authority to require city agencies, utilities such as Con Ed and other utilities, and contractors and others to submit their databases to the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications in order to create this database which will, I believe, save lives in the future. I also would like to let you know that we have experienced in this country, as you know, school shootings and other school shootings. If you wish to speak to me, I'm forming an organization called Stop School Shootings, which will use this very technology as a way to prevent and/or more rapidly respond to these incidents than heretofore has been possible. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wendy Dorf?
Yeah. My name is Wendy Dorf, and I represent GISMO, the Geospatial Information Systems and Mapping Organization. My career in city government spanned 34 years, including 6 years as a legislative analyst at the City Council Finance Unit, and 21 years of service at New York City DEP, where I directed mapping of the city's water supply system and worked on the development of New York City's base map. I directed infrastructure mapping at the Emergency Mapping and Data Center following the 9/11 attack. While working at New York City DEP in the mid-'80s, I was tasked with an effort to manage a project to digitize and create a 6,000-mile network of the city's water mains. The budgetary justification for mapping the accurate location of water mains was to coordinate planning and operations, and also to facilitate design and construction to reduce excess costs incurred by delays in construction. Further, if the city was able to locate a water main rapidly, property damage and payments associated with those damages could be reduced. This could only be accomplished with a network map of water mains made possible with the use of geospatial information systems. The successful implementation of the water main map for operations at DEP convinced the managers to fund a citywide sewer map layer. New York City is one of the very few cities in the world that has digital maps of its water and sewer systems. I was in charge of the underground infrastructure mapping of the World Trade Center site. I worked with DEP, DDC, MTA, the Port Authority, Con Edison, Empire City, etc. I collected maps of different scales and media and supervised a team of GIS technicians and engineers assigned to align or layer the maps for use by the responders as they navigated the World Trade Center site. It took several weeks to bring all of this information together, but it enabled us to discover a buried tank of Freon gas threatened by underground fires, and enabled us to take measures to avoid the release of phosgene mustard gas. Since 9/11, I have been working on the development of an accurate, integrated underground infrastructure map for first responders. Also, since 9/11, we have canvassed colleagues, interviewed agency executives, had presentations with representatives, etc., all of whom agreed that this initiative is critical for emergency response and the development of New York as the premier smart city. The project has been stalled due to lack of funding. My efforts in advancing the use of GIS for infrastructure has been seriously impeded by a lack of leadership, a lack of planning, and difficulties with coordination between city infrastructure agencies and utilities. Yet recent analysis has shown that city infrastructure agencies and utilities could save billions of dollars by having complete, accurate, and interoperable infrastructure data. Available interoperable utility data is also critical for disaster planning and response. I support amendments to Chapter 48, Do It, of the City Charter. I think others have defined those amendments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Dorff. I would also like to say we've been joined by Commissioner Cordero, who is sitting down there and to my left. Next, we have John F. Manning, who I believe also testified before us previously.
Sure.
Thank you. My name is John Manning. I am a civil servant and a lifelong New Yorker. Last September, I testified for campaign finance and lobbying reforms that would empower the citizenry and end the control of big money over local government, how this issue is the root cause of many other problems, and to ask the Charter Revision Commission to place democracy vouchers on the November ballot as an alternative to the current campaign finance system. Thank you for the opportunity to speak again. The biggest shortcoming in our political system today is the near impossibility of conducting a successful election campaign without accepting huge sums of money from lobbyists, special interests, and political action committees. The seemingly unchallengeable power of the real estate industry in New York City and state government is just one of many examples of how our democratic process has been corrupted. The lobbying industry, as it currently exists, is nothing less than legalized bribery. The mayor, governor, our city council members, and our state legislatures are supposed to be wrestling with representing the interests of their constituents and doing what is best for the society as a whole. They should not be responding to whichever lobby donates the greatest amount of money to their campaigns or what special interest dangles lucrative post-government employment in front of them. That corruption, fraud, and pay-to-play have become so pervasive in New York government that it is hard for honest and competent people to get elected is a direct result of our current campaign finance and lobbying laws. If every registered voter in the city were allocated 4 democracy vouchers worth $25 or $50 each to give to the candidates of their choice, it would encourage high voter turnout and enable well-meaning people of modest means to run for office. Democracy vouchers are currently being used in Seattle, Washington, and are being considered in numerous other cities and states. The staff report states that democracy vouchers are a new thing and that there is a lawsuit challenging democracy vouchers in Washington state. That lawsuit was dismissed in Superior Court and is currently being appealed. If you read the suit, the legal briefs, and the Superior Court's decision to dismiss it, you will find the logic and arguments of the suit unconvincing. There is nothing new, radical, or unconstitutional about wanting to replace corruption and pay-to-play with honest, good government. The lobbying industry finds democracy vouchers to be a mortal threat and is trying to kill this before it catches on. Democracy vouchers, limiting other campaign donations to small amounts, and ending third-party donations from lobbying firms and bundlers could cause the current political climate of citizen complacency and low voter turnout to be replaced with idealism, leadership, and community involvement. Democracy vouchers will open up our political process, giving voters better choices. It will enable all kinds of citizens who care about their communities to run for office or otherwise get involved in civic affairs. Let's have the courage and integrity to end the grip that big money, lobbyists, and special interests have on our noble democratic process. Please give the voters the choice this November to amend the New York City Charter to create democracy vouchers and end large bundled and third-party donations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manning. Before I ask whether any commissioners have questions, I want to say that I've been asked to say that a Nissan Murano, license plate GXD8238, is blocking the exit of cars from the parking lot. So if that is your car, if you could please move it so that people could exit or enter, I think the people would appreciate that. Again, that's GXD8238, and it's a Nissan Murano. Okay. Any questions, Sal?
Yes, I just want to commend John Manning on his testimony. As you know, Mr. Manning, that's one of my top priorities, and I was disappointed that it was relegated to other proposals, but I will tell you that I will move the question and get a vote on democracy vouchers at some point. So I think, as you pointed out, it's the gold standard for democracy in America. It's the best campaign finance system that's been created. I'm impressed with it. Seattle and has had a second round. It's more successful than the first round. And we also believe that Austin and Albuquerque will be adopting it. We've got to stop the pay-to-play in New York City, and this is the way to do it.
Thank you, Sal. Are there any other questions, comments? Thank you, panel. As this panel leaves, the next panel, I have Scott Ulray, or Yolray, Jamani Williams, and Francesco Brindisi.
Jamani Williams. Where's Jamani? Oh, there he is.
Put him in the first queue after. It's okay.
Me first, okay.
Mr. Ulray, if you would like to start.
Yes, okay. Good evening. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to present testimony to the Commission tonight. My name is Scott Ulray. I am General Counsel at the New York City Office of Management and Budget. I have worked at OMB for the past 22 years. I have worked for 3 mayors and 6 budget directors. I have been at OMB during times of serious economic stress, including the period following September 11th and the financial crisis of 2008. Through these periods, I think there has been general agreement that the city has managed its budget and finances extraordinarily well. I attribute much of that success to the budgetary discipline that's laid out in the city charter. Therefore, I'm here to urge you to resist the temptation to tamper with the budget provisions that currently exist in the charter. These provisions were well thought out by people who were closer to the fiscal crisis of the 1970s than we are today. The budget provisions of the charter work together to provide the foundation for the financial success that the city has enjoyed. There is no need to undermine that foundation now. OMB has already provided testimony at your previous hearing and in writing. Our position has not changed. We're very pleased to see that the Commission's preliminary report eliminated some of the proposals to which we objected. However, we continue to recommend against the remaining proposals under consideration. With respect to units of appropriation, OMB has expressed its willingness to work with the Council to address their concern about the specificity of agencies' units of appropriation. We believe there's a path to addressing these concerns without resorting to amendment of the Charter. With respect to impoundment, this is a power that should be left to the mayor, who has the ultimate responsibility both for ensuring that the city ends the fiscal year in balance and for managing the operations of different agencies and their budgets. We strongly disagree with any attempt to legislate limitations on that power. With respect to the rainy day fund, as former Budget Director Mark Page testified, the idea of a rainy day fund sounds appealing, but the specifics of how money is to be contributed to and dispersed from the fund is very difficult to legislate. Specific mandates that have been proposed for contributions to the fund and limitations on the use of those funds would have resulted in material cuts to the city's operating budget and a concomitant impact on city services. OMB has proved that it is very good at managing the budget through difficult economic cycles, and it should be allowed to continue doing this job without having its hands tied by a formula that may or may not reflect the realities of any particular fiscal year. With respect to independent budgets, there's no reason that certain agencies or other entities should be especially privileged above others by mandating a specific level of funding. I will just conclude by saying that the city has achieved extraordinary success with its budgetary and financial management. It's balanced its budget for the last 38 years. It's achieved AA1, AA ratings from the 3 major rating agencies. It's a model among other cities for its sound financial management. The current provisions of the Charter have provided a foundation for this, and I hope that the Commission will consider not proceeding with the proposed budgetary amendments at this time. And I'll turn this over to Francesco Brindisi, who will speak.
No, hold on 1 minute. As I asked in the beginning, if you have used your phone and forgotten to turn it off now, if you could either turn your phones off or put it on airplane mode, I would really appreciate it. Actually, Jumani Williams was next, the next person I called, and then Francesco Brindisi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and all the commissioners. My name is Jumani Williams, and I have the pleasure of serving as the newly elected public advocate for the City of New York. I do have a lot of ideas, but I'm going to focus it on my office today. As a public advocate, I serve as a direct link between New Yorkers and their government. The office acts as a watchdog to ensure that city agencies are efficient and effective as demanded by the people of New York. The office also investigates and resolves constituent complaints relating to the services provided by these agencies. As the second highest ranking elected official in the city, however, my ability to serve New Yorkers is currently impaired by the present language in the New York City Charter. While the Charter is a living document that has grown and changed, just as our city has grown and changed, the language governing the public advocate's ability has not kept pace. As the Charter Revision Commission is undergoing the process of the first top-to-bottom review since 1989, I urge the body to take several actions to improve the effectiveness of the office. I'd like to recommend 3 concrete areas: independent budget. The mayor and the city council currently determine the budget of the office, which is inconsistent and subject to political whims of the parties every year. As an example, the office is empowered to introduce legislation as a method to cure systemic flaws and shortcomings that negatively impact the public. However, what may be practically necessary for the New Yorkers on the street may not be politically expedient in the moment for other parties. This disconnect can result in pushback through the budgetary process. Already, the current budget for the public advocate is smaller than each of the individual borough presidents, yet the public advocate's constituency encompasses all 8.6 million New York City residents. Even in this short time, I've seen how many of these residents rely on the office to resolve complaints about allegations of systemic abuses and fraud. Effective service of these residents is a two-way street, as those closest to the problem are often best positioned to recommend improvements to agencies' operations, which my office can then pursue legislatively or otherwise. As a system where the public advocate must rely on the elected officials it is charged with overseeing to determine the budget by which the public advocate can conduct that oversight is an inherent limit to the office. Independently elected officials should not have to weigh possible retaliation from the mayor or the council when bringing issues to light. Subpoena power. At present, the charter states that the office shall have timely access to those records and documents of city agencies which the public advocate deems necessary to complete the investigations, inquiries, and reviews. However, city agencies are not clearly legally obligated to comply with these requests without a subpoena, delaying investigations that the Office of the Public Advocate is required to conduct. Giving the office a full subpoena power would better allow the office to fulfill its duties as mandated by the existing charter, and we do know we would win in court if we had to use that, but that is a lengthier process. Standing to sue, the public advocate standing to sue on behalf of the office's 8.6 million constituents is unclear at best. In addition, the law department has determined over which cases can be pursued, which violates the intended separation of power among city officials. Granting the office clear standing to sue is an essential tool that the public advocate requires in order to prove transparency and accountability in New York City. Additionally, I agree with several proposals that the City Council and others have previously put forward, including providing the public advocate with appointments to the CCRB, conflict of interest, LPC, franchise concessions. I further believe we should explore having the independent budget office report to the public advocate and using the public advocate's office as a central resource for community boards across the city. Do not agree that the Department of Investigation should be under public advocate. I do think there needs to be another agency that can oversee everyone, including the public advocate's office, or at least pay a check on us. To increase our transparency, accountability, and effectiveness, the revisions I recommend above are critical and necessary. I look forward to working with you to ensure that the city adopts a charter that reflects the current landscape and the will of the people in New York City. Again, thank you to the Commission for taking up this work, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I would say of all of these, they are critically important. The independent budget, however, probably tops them because without the independent budget, some of the other ones would not be exercised by everyone as the way it should. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Francesco Brindisi.
Excellent. Can you hear me? Well, last time I had problem with the microphone. I'm the Deputy Director at the Office of Management and Budget for Economics, Revenues, and Policy. So I have the distinct pleasure of formulating the revenue forecast for the mayor. As you know, the charter says that the mayor needs to submit to City Council an estimate of non-property tax revenues that are going to accrue in the following fiscal year. And the mayor has not only the responsibility to provide a balanced budget for the incoming fiscal year, but also to deliver an actual balanced budget, not just projected at the end of the day. So this has two implications. One, it provides for accountability of the mayor in delivering this balanced budget, and also implies that it has fiscal responsibility constraints on the mayor himself. I think I would not be mistaken by saying that everybody knows that OMB is cautious in its revenue estimates. That is part of the reasons, it's the implication of the fact that the mayor has to provide a revenue estimate that allows him to balance the budget. The cautiousness of our revenue estimates have been praised and are one of the strengths of our ratings. And it's one of the things that allows us to keep our borrowing rates low and allow us to have a strong capital budget and allow us to keep the fiscal health of the city. This is all I want to say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take questions. First on my list is Jim, Paula, and Lisette, but I have one question first, Mr. Brindisi. On March 26th, we sent you an email with a series of questions that had arisen during the expert testimony phase that we had, and I was wondering if you could tell us when we might expect a response?
Why never?
Excuse me.
Well, I'm not sure why never.
I didn't say never.
The email was received by me and Chuck Brisky. It was forwarded to the OMB chief of staff and other people that deal with external communications. I have not. I don't know when you're going to receive an answer. I know that there have been negotiations on this particular points, and you have changed some of the things that are in the report. But I'm not the one that decides when responses go out and when communication goes out from OMB to the external public.
If you could communicate back to whoever it is that is making the decision about when we might have a response, or if we might have a response, or let us know who that person is, we'd be happy to get in touch with them ourselves.
Okay, absolutely. Also, I'm here to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I have Jim, then Paula.
Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you, Scott. Scott, my question's for Scott. The charter says that each unit of appropriation in the budget is supposed to be for a particular program, purpose, activity, and it says particular. Do you think, my example that I've been using is the Department of Homeless Services, $1.9 billion of a $2 billion budget is in a single unit. Do you think that is what the charter had in mind when they used that language?
I think we're in compliance with the terms of the charter. I think that the specific language about the units of appropriation is an area that's appropriate for discussion. And if there are particular areas such as that one that the council feels the unit of appropriation is just too broad, I understand that feeling, and I think that that should be addressed and discussed with them. My issue is that I don't think it's necessary or desirable to do that through the language of the charter.
I just, I've said this to you before. I was finance counsel at the city council. Scott was deputy general counsel at OMB, so we've had these discussions before for years. There have been times when the council has made a serious effort to negotiate with OMB, and we got more line item information for some of the agencies. And then when it came time to put any of that into the actual legal part of the budget, we were told, no, that's going too far. So that's why I believe it needs to be done by charter.
Yeah.
But,
Thank you, Jim. Paula is next.
Thank you.
We'll give you a second round.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you all for being here. I wanted to pose the question to OMB about the risk of changing the mayor's role in impoundment and the mayor's position in impoundment. What is the risk to our city if we were to change that?
I think, the impoundment power isn't used much, but it's an important power. The mayor ultimately needs to make the city go, including balancing the budget and making appropriations to different agencies work. And the impoundment power goes along with the other powers in the charter that works together to provide the mayor the tools that are necessary to do that. I think undermining that power and circumscribing that power is not in the city's interest. We don't know what's coming. We don't know what's ahead in terms of the economy, the budget. It's a power that we need to preserve for the mayor.
Lisette, and then Sal.
So thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to ask if you can elaborate on a couple of things. So from the testimony, I heard that OMB provides generally conservative estimates, and that the mayor, in order to be held accountable, is also the one who has the responsibility to deliver on the balanced budget. Can you talk a little bit about what would happen if there's if the agencies don't receive the revenue that it expects, or that if there's overspending, what's the consequence of that?
Well, I guess there are two issues, right? One is whether there is a revenue forecast that does not come to be, and then there's the issue of overspending. Either way, the budget needs to be balanced, right? So that means that there would have to be programs to eliminate the gap if a gap were to occur during the fiscal year, which means that with Office of Management and Budget would resort to cutting agencies' budgets in order to balance the budget. I don't know if you want to.
Or I would just add, we were discussing the impoundment power. In a crisis situation, that impoundment power is there to result in balance at the end of the year.
And which of the proposals, so we talked through at a higher level on the revenue side, so I just wanted to confirm that what your position is with respect to the proposals currently being considered with respect to the third-party fail-safe. You can expand a little your position.
I'm not sure about the term fail-safe. I'm not sure that I understand it completely, but as I mentioned, the responsibility for balancing the budget is the mayor's, and services that need to be provided are to be provided by the executive, and as well as the cuts that might be at risk should revenues not come through, right? And so we are strongly against any change that would shift the responsibility of providing a revenue forecast to a third party that is not accountable to anybody.
Thank you.
Sal, and then Steve.
Public Advocate Williams, welcome and congratulations on your election. I have two questions. As you know, the power of money in politics is crippling our democracy. And in New York City, even though we claim to have a great campaign finance system, lobbyists and developers can bundle money. And most of the money that's donated comes from wealthy zip codes. I was wondering if you had reviewed what Seattle is doing in terms of democracy vouchers, which will provide every single New York City resident with $4 $25 vouchers, equalizing and leveling the playing field. Whether you live in public housing or in the wealthy areas of the city, you'll get the same 4 vouchers. So I wanted to get your opinion on that. And the second question is, you were elected in an open primary, and I was wondering what your view is on nonpartisan or open primaries.
I support nonpartisan and open primaries.
You do?
Yes, and I support what I've heard of the voucher system in Seattle. I've only known what I've heard. I'm sorry, what I've read from articles. It sounds like a good system. I don't know the pitfalls from it. Our system, I think, is better than what was there before, but an organization like the CFB, which think they're a co-equal branch of government, makes it very difficult for some folks. So I support anything that takes big money out and gives power to folks and equalizes as much as possible.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I'd like to go into more detail with you. I think one of your consultants, Joy Williams, is a big fan of democracy vouchers. I was on her radio program recently, so she knows a lot about it. But I'll forward you an article, and I'd love to follow up with you on that.
Sure.
Thank you, Sal. Steve?
Public Advocate Williams. Councilmember Albanese.
The light has to be on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mr. Public Advocate, let me join Councilmember Albanese in congratulating you on your historic victory. Wish you all the best. Since he asked you the question I wanted to ask you, that's all I'm going to ask you or say to you tonight is congratulations and best of luck. But I just want to clarify one thing. You said you support both open primaries and nonpartisan elections?
Yeah, I was actually going I was actually answer too quickly. I do want to do some more thinking about the open primaries. I definitely support nonpartisan election. I do want to think a little bit more about the open primaries and the pitfalls from that, but I support anything that kind of opens up the system for a lot of folks.
Thank you. And now for OMB.
Sorry, and just, you didn't ask me, but I just want to say I do think the units of appropriation are too large. So I just want to make sure I got on the record of that.
Well, that's a great segue for me to OMB. There are two areas. I tend to be very sympathetic with your position on 95% of everything, including units of appropriation. But tonight, I think a door was opened, or an opportunity was opened, to maybe put this thing to bed. You expressed a willingness to work with the City Council. That's great. I can tell you that if you read the 89 transcripts, this was something they wrestled with, and we've been wrestling with it for 30 years. A willingness to do something and actually engaging in that discussion are two different things. Are you presently engaged with leadership at the City Council to frame a units of appropriation solution so that this commission wouldn't have to step in? Is that engagement actually taking place in practice rather than in the abstract?
I believe a discussion has been occurring to date already on that subject, and I personally am committing to continue that discussion in a meaningful way through this process.
Well, that's great. I think we look forward to hearing about the progress between now and the end of our discussions here, because I think that for someone like me might take care of that particular issue. There's one issue that I have a strong disagreement on, and that's with respect to the rainy day fund, or whatever you want to call it. I understand that there are difficulties, gap-related impediments, but here's where I differ greatly. I concede and gladly do so that New York City fiscally is run as a municipality, probably number one in the nation. We've got great practices in place as a result of the fiscal crisis of the 70s. So I concede that point. We balance our budget, we've got a 4-year plan, and we've got a 10-year view. But where we're not delivering, and by the way, it's not only New York, it's every level of government, it's every household. Where we're not delivering is ensuring that the city is adequately protected to weather an economic downturn. And you know how I know that? Because after 9/11, when we were coming this close to paying off the MAC bonds, we extended it, didn't we? We extended it after nearly 20 years to extend it another 20 years. So I really think OMB would do a service to the city in working with us to craft a rainy day solution, because the truth of the matter is there's $250 billion in liabilities in the out years that have to be answered to. And here's what I know. In an age of term limits, folks don't care about 30 years from now. They don't care about 3 years from now. So we've really got to address the long-term liabilities, and I'd ask you, and this is how I'll close, Madam Chair, if you could provide the commission, with your thoughts on how we could take the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Fund and have it stop being a quasi-rainy day fund and actually have those monies protected for the future. Those monies are there for future and current retiree benefits. With respect to health. I'm not talking about pensions, I'm just talking about health. So I'd really appreciate two things. One, a serious dialogue with the City Council leadership before we conclude our business on the units of appropriation issue, because that would go a long way in helping me to resolve this. DCAS has over 13, I think, units of appropriation. Police Department has 1 or 2. So it can be done. It can be done. 18. So it can be done. I think the proof is there. It's just got to be done across the board. So that and the rainy day fund. And I'd get off your backs, I promise you.
Sorry, Jim, do you have another question? And then we're going to move on.
Okay. Scott again, sorry. I think every time we've heard somebody talk about impoundment, it's always been that, the mayor has to have the ability to address an emergency or a revenue downturn, or, why not say just that impoundment has to be for a financial reason? Because the council is the under the state constitution, it's the legislative body of the city. So the council's supposed to set policy. My only goal is to stop an errant mayor from impounding money because he doesn't like either the policy behind a program or the person or institution proposing the program.
You know, an economic downturn is the most prominent example that I can think of for when impoundment would need to be employed. I think in most cases that's probably it. But I can't foresee what might happen in the future or why there might be some reason that it's necessary for the mayor to act outside that limitation. And I think I'm reluctant to amend the charter in a way that restricts the mayor's powers in that way. I don't think it's necessary.
I would just say, Scott, that when we had Eric Lane from the 1989 Charter Revision Commission, he expressed the view that the 89 Charter Revision Commission did not intend for the mayor to use the power in the way that Jim was describing, but only as a response to a financial situation. And there is nothing that the staff has proposed that would limit the mayor's ability to use impoundment in such a situation, but would only limit his ability to use it outside of a financial situation. I'm not looking to engage in a colloquy on that, but I just wanted to put that on. If you want to answer, you can, but.
Well, I would just say, you know, as I said, I think a financial downturn and economic distress situation is in most cases why that would be used, and I understand that why people would think that was the priority. I am reluctant to limit the use to that particular situation because we don't know what could happen in the future or why that power might be necessary.
Even though the Charter Revision Commission didn't think they were giving it to the mayor in 1989, despite that.
I can't address that point.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like.
Madam, I'm sorry, because of time limits, I had to focus on just the public advocate's office, but I wanted to make sure, I was just on the record saying that I believe the powers of the mayor are way too strong, and I did a report with then Councilmember Dangarodic speaking about the empowerment powers and the units of appropriation, among other things. So I just want to be on the record saying I do think those are two things that need to be looked at. Very often, the constituents of New York City come to the council to do things that we just don't have the power to do based on the power that the mayor has. And as a branch of government that should be doing what Jim described and other things, we have to rebalance. It's the most powerful mayoralty in the entire country, from Giuliani to Bloomberg to Bill de Blasio, no matter who it is. And it just has to be rebalanced a little bit. I just want to make sure I'm on the record for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the panel and call the next panel. I have Hal Phillips, Florida Miranda, Roberto Rodriguez, and I understand Mr. Rodriguez is bringing with him a translator, Lucas Renike, and Councilman Brad Lander. Mr. Phillips.
Hi, I've come tonight to speak about ranked choice voting, which I feel is a very important reform that our city has long needed. I would like to thank the Commission for the consideration that you've already given to this issue, and I'd like to make a brief case for why this should extend not only to citywide elections, but also to local elections like city council races. I did a little bit of research into city council primary results in the last two cycles, 2017 and 2013, to get a sense of how often ranked choice voting might have made a difference. What I found is that in these two cycles, we had 40 city council primaries with 3 or more candidates, and of those 40, 30 were won by a candidate who received under 50% of the vote, 12 were won by a candidate who received under 40%, and 3 of these primaries were won by a candidate who won under 30% of the vote. The lowest winning percentage that any city council primary candidate had in these last 2 cycles was as low as 24.4%. Now, with no disrespect intended toward any of the winning candidates, this seems like an obviously broken and shockingly anti-democratic system when we have elected officials in office today who were voted against by a vast majority of their voting constituents, yet were still deemed elected. And I'm very concerned that this may repeat in 2021 when we're likely to have dozens of open seats. And I think if we don't have ranked choice voting, we will have we'll have more official winners who didn't even win 1/3 of the vote. And I also suspect that given some recent trends, including the ability of social media to amplify the voices of candidates who might previously have been overlooked, we are going to see more and more elections with a large number of competitive candidates, which I think is a good thing for democracy, but under our current system, that can mean more and more split votes. If we want our election results to reflect the will of the voters, it is vital that we reform our process before we once again elect people to office with less than 1/4 of the vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miranda? Or Ms. Miranda?
Yes. Buenas tardes, miembros de esta asamblea. Mi nombre es Florida Miranda y vengo de Williamsburg, en Brooklyn, en los sures. La ciudad de Nueva York es una de las segregadas, dado que tienen pólizas equivocadas, desplazamiento con la integridad de esta comunidad. En el 2005, en Williamsburg, tuvimos una rezonificación bastante impactante en la zona frente al río, la cual ha abierto varios comercios.
Un momento, por favor. Mr. Renike?
Yeah, do you want me to translate as she goes or at the end?
At the end, I guess.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. La cual ha abierto varios comercios pero fue el ejemplo a seguir para los desarrolladores de bienes y raíces, haciendo multimillonarios aquí en nuestra ciudad, conformada nuestro bienestar, los miembros de nuestra comunidad. El problema más grande fue la discriminación que ocurrió en la causa de esta rezonificación, ya que las personas que vivimos en el área, después de ahí fuimos a la rezonificación de sitio Domino Sugar. Ahora vamos a tener la rezonificación de sitio Pfizer, que también ya empezaron nuestra calidad de vida como miembros comunitarios de bajos ingresos. Yo creo que estamos decepcionados en los resultados preliminares del informe. La comisión, porque no consideramos varios puntos debajo de la coalición, a la cual representemos, que dan una serie de estacionadores que cambian los problemas ambientales, económicos, de educación y acceso a comidas para residentes de nuestras comunidades. Pensamos que la comisión debe tomar en cuenta recomendaciones hechas que trabajen investigando con respeto a la calidad de aire. Necesitamos poner real y valiosos con revisiones que dan principios. Podemos un día recibir igualdad todas las comunidades de nuestros barrios, de la ciudad, de toda la ciudad de Nueva York. Necesitamos con todo respeto que nos pongan atención para todas las comunidades. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Y Mr. Reneke?
Sí, está muy bien. Good afternoon. My name is Florida Miranda. I come from Williamsburg, from the south side of Williamsburg, representing Los Sures. The city of New York is one of the most segregated, given that it has policies which put displacement equal with trying to translate on the fly, confuse integration with the displacement of various communities. In 2005 in Williamsburg, we had a very impactful rezoning on the area of our waterfront, which has opened various commerces and changed our neighborhood a lot. But it became the example which developers have followed, looking to become multimillionaires in our city, costing our communities our well-being, even though we oppose those rezonings. The largest problem for our community was the discrimination that occurred because of this rezoning, since the people who have moved in have not been our community. From there, we had the rezoning of the Domino site, and now we have the rezoning of the Pfizer site, which will also worsen our quality of life and our ability to stay in our neighborhood as members of the community. We are saddened by the preliminary results of the report, the Commission's report, because various points which the coalition which we are part of were not considered. These include giving a series of standards which would change environmental issues, economic issues, education, and food access for residents of communities like ours. We believe that the Commission should take into account recommendations made which would mitigate concerns of air quality and how funds are allocated for infrastructure improvements in neighborhoods such as ours. What our community really needs, in summary, is real power, and only with revisions to the charter, which change the principles of the charter, will one day all communities of our city receive true equity, and that is what we're here for tonight. Communities like ours, we would like to have really a voice and a say in the way that our city works. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of this commission. I want to say thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak today.
And you
My
are
name is Roberto
Rodriguez? You're Roberto Rodriguez?
Roberto Rodriguez, and I'm from Los Sures Lucha in South Williamsburg. New York City's charter reform and its commissioners have an opportunity to create a comprehensive plan that would provide a guideline that ensures equity and segregation without displacement. The charter is not a business plan. It should be a reflection of the values of equity, inclusiveness, sustainability, and resilience, and transparency and accountability. Currently, our city's lack of comprehensive plan allows for the city's land to be treated like an asset, to be a bargain if the capital budget was coordinated with the comprehensive plan's community investment. The budget would then cover the needs of the community, eliminating the bargaining process that occurs with a council member and a developer or DCP. The bargaining happens as a result of the council member needing investment for infrastructure that his budget may not cover. This would terminate the trade-off of displacement and investment over long-standing community members' viability. In Williamsburg, we have made the trade-off of a park, 2 Trees Domino Park, for the community for a large development that will help skyrocket the city's AMI and help displace many other community members like myself. And you may ask about that luxurious park that we built for the community. Well, let's just say that the buildings are not even fully inhabited, but community members with their children have been told by newcomers they're not welcome in that space. In 2005, we participated in the ULER process and made recommendations for North Brooklyn waterfront rezoning through Community Board, which since has been disregarded by the developer. Sure, the area has become lucrative for commercialization and business investment, but the newcomer tenants have their own private shuttle services, access to their own community park, and have brought in the need for private landlords to buy out and decontrol tenants out of their homes in surrounding buildings. A comprehensive plan would stop treating our city's community as assets, and it would provide a standard to follow when a rezoning occurs so that investment in low-income community doesn't continue at the expense of losing the culture everyone is so proud of when they refer to New York City. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Councilmember Lander?
Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks very much to the Commission for your service and for the opportunity to appear before you this evening. It's also an honor to be on this panel with my friends from Los Sures and the Thriving Communities Coalition, and my friends from the Brooklyn Voters Alliance and the Ranked Choice Voting Coalition. Those are the two issues I would like to speak briefly about. I'm very enthusiastic about the Commission staff recommendation around ranked choice voting, and I agree with my colleague, we really should go all in here. If anything, council races are where there's the most reason to do ranked choice voting, with so many candidates and so many races that don't garner a majority. We don't want confusion about where we're doing it and where we're not doing it. Let's do it on all municipal offices. And I will say my read of the data that the Fair Vote Coalition has put forward suggests there isn't that much need to worry about ballot exhaustion. Maybe we let people rank 5 offices so we have confidence that we're going to get enough. If we don't do it, I'm not that worried we'll have runoffs, because I don't think that ballot exhaustion is a big issue, but I don't want to confuse people with the 50% threshold, the 40% threshold. Let's go all in. Let's do it for all primaries and specials. Let's do it for all city offices. Let's use ranked choice voting, make the proposal to use ranked choice voting for all those offices. I really think we'll get a better democracy out of it. I want to speak a little more about these planning questions, and I'm really glad to be on this panel. There were some things in the staff report that I really agree with here. The idea that the current process exacerbates disillusionment and confusion with all the different reports is really true. But I also want to point out, it's not only that they're disconnected from each other, it's that they don't add up to a coherent, data-based, values-driven vision for the future of the city, giving us the ability to attend to sea level rise and climate change, to affordability and displacement and inequality, to infrastructure investments amidst infrastructure that's a century old. That's really the goal. And so the goals that are put out of this idea, and I'm happy with the idea of a planning cycle, something that happens over time, but I think it really needs to meet the challenges that you've set in the report, something that ensures such plans address those challenges with specific indicators for measuring progress consistently, and requires that short, medium, and long-term plans, future rezonings, the 10-year capital strategy, infrastructure investments, actually conform to the plan that is developed through people's participation. So that's how I read the report. I just think that is a high bar. And I guess what I would say is, taken seriously, that gives us a real opportunity to align with our values. But taken just facially and not seriously, it really could just be a set of reports in color-coordinated covers, done on a timeline, set between 2 bookends on a shelf, but still with no meaningful impact on the future development, investment, capital planning, and land use strategies for the city. So here are a few questions.
That's your 3-minute mark, but just if you could sum up your questions?
Sure. The process has to start with getting strategic alignment on a big set of questions. How much growth do we think we actually need in housing or in jobs? What are the key infrastructure investments that facilitate that growth? Where should it go? If we care about integration, should it be in higher income neighborhoods as much as low income ones, which has not been the case of the rezoning so far? A set of principles like that have to get set out. For resiliency, what are the kinds of neighborhoods that we're going to build defensive infrastructure for? Where will we prepare people? Where might we retreat? What are our key equity investments? Do we think integration without displacement is important? Then what land use strategies do we need? What kinds of zones are appropriate? Should we be looking at all our auto-dependent C8 corridors to upzone them with mandatory inclusionary? Should we follow the city of Minneapolis and consider whether single-family home zones should be upzoned to allow duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes? So there's a whole set of questions that need to get consensus on, and I actually think that there should be data from the start. The values that thriving communities have put out are a really good set of values. It goes through a process, not a ULURP process at the front end, but a process of input and feedback, and then the council needs to vote on that set of strategic goals, or else there's not going to be a sense of collective buy-in that starts to bind future development. And then finally, what you need is a real set of mechanisms that make sure that all the future plans, each additional report, but also subsequent rezonings and subsequent capital budgets are aligned with that strategy. And that's what I'm waiting to see. We offered 3 ideas in our concept of comprehensive plan that maybe could be broken down and broken apart. Maybe there are others, but our ideas were, 1, make the 10-year capital strategy really sticky. It's got to be tied to the plan that's developed, and communities, if they work to get something in it, have to have confidence it's going to show up in the budget and not just be a notional document. 2nd, make subsequent actions that are aligned with the plan able to move more quickly through the ULURP process with an opportunity for appeal, but something that makes it more appealing, both for developers and for City Hall, to bring actions that are plan aligned and doesn't make it easier for them to bring actions that are not consistent with the plan. And the 3rd idea, which I think was the most controversial in the first round, was to try to do a comprehensive generic EIS on that plan, which again could be done in a cycle rather than in a comprehensive plan, but again has the opportunity, and I'm happy to talk offline or in more detail about some areas where we really believe that could make these plans that we're talking about not just color coordinated on a shelf, but sticky, not just because there'll be less disillusionment and more input, because we would be better able to confront the challenges of a growing city, get the infrastructure investments right, attend to sustainability and resilience, deal with issues of equity in an inequitable city. We're open to other mechanisms, but it can't just be a color coordinated set of covers between 2 bookends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? I see Sal. Sal, you're up.
Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for your testimony. What you described, unfortunately, has happened in many areas of the city where the zoning proposals have caused significant displacement of folks that have lived there for a long time, and hopefully it's not too late to kind of mitigate that. I wanted to ask you, if you had your druthers, what would you like to have seen in the plan for Williamsburg, a comprehensive plan?
What I would like to see in Williamsburg, especially south side of Williamsburg, is the right to an enshrinement in the Constitution where what we say will be taken seriously into consideration, that it doesn't become something that will be on a paper, that our voices should be heard. In this way, you won't see a flip-flop like you saw with Amazon. If the people have been taken into consideration, if the people have been given the opportunities to speak about that, then we wouldn't have seen that situation. This is what I would like to see happening in Williamsburg. Thank you.
Basically, you're asking for input that is correct. That has real meaning. In other words, instead of lip service and sketches and what have you. But how would you keep average folks who've lived there a long time, who are working class people? What is your recommendation for making sure that they're able to stay there?
The community, the voice of the community. This is the essence. We've lived in these communities for 50 years. We know these communities. People talk about gentrification and so forth. We can live together. We can live together and we can prosper together, but you can't just eliminate what the roots that have been planted in these areas. And this is what I like the commissioners to see, that there is a lot of culture, a lot of history in South Williamsburg, and we just don't want to see it destroyed and vanished.
Thank you.
Can I give one reflection on this?
The thing I would point out here also is, of the 10 neighborhoods that either have been or are in the process of being rezoned by the de Blasio administration, 9 of the 10 are low-income or working-class communities of color. And 1, Gowanus, is in a neighborhood that is whiter and wealthier. So the message and there was no plan for that at the beginning. I assume we would have said, if we had had a plan, let's balance out the rezoning so that we're not targeting particular communities. But the current process doesn't allow for us to do that at the start or hold ourselves to a standard. And then, of course, neighborhoods feel unfairly targeted, and rightly so.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'd like to thank this panel then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And call the next panel.
Muy bien.
We do see you when you do that, and I do notice, and I appreciate it. The next panel is Tim Coley, or Cole, Craig Seaman, Frederick Johnson, and Ilya Schwartzberg. Mr. Cole or Mr. Coley, how do you pronounce your name, sir?
Coley.
Okay, I was right the first time.
I'm a resident of the Inwood neighborhood, northern Manhattan.
Are you Mr. Coley?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I understand that the Charter Review Commission is making recommendations to enhance community engagement about land use in the city. Inwood was recently rezoned. The entire local community board opposed the plan. The borough president came out against much of the plan. People in the neighborhood came up with alternate plans and comments, but received perfunctory answers that did not answer our concerns, and rezoning is now in place. Rezoning will add 30-story buildings, thousands of new apartments will be added, yet sustainable practices for sewage and water are not addressed by the city's rezoning plan. 1/3 of Inwood lies in the floodplain, and climate change is not taken into account. Thousands of new cars in the neighborhood with a hospital will increase gridlock, parking problems, emergency response times, stress on the train and sewage systems, and asthma rates. Once the new buildings are in place, this cannot be undone. The city has not taken the cumulative impact of all these effects on rezoning into account. The city has done a consistently poor job when trying to predict the results and impacts of rezoning. For example, the Long Island City rezoning created not the predicted 300 new residential units, but 10,000 municipal art society Title II rezonings. We are asking for better provisions to take people's comments into account, and we are concerned about the environmental effects of the rezoning plan that so many of the neighborhood residents oppose. We hope the Commission will recommend changes to the charter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coley. The next speaker is Mr. Seaman, Craig Seaman.
Yes, I'm Craig Seaman, Green Party State Committeeman, former chair of the state party, and a former 2001 New York City Council candidate, and I came in second out of 5 candidates. Ranked choice voting has to be instituted in the general election as well. It would be the bold change that would empower the alternative parties and even unaffiliated candidates and voters. Voters would become more comfortable voting for these alternative candidates, and unaffiliated candidates can take advantage of our improved ballot access. As you know, now under the last charter revision changes, a city council candidate, Democrat, would need 450 signatures for city council. An unaffiliated candidate would need the same 450 signatures. So by opening up the general election, you now open up an election to unaffiliated candidates. And unaffiliated voters would have more influence over the outcome. But in addition to that, by making the general elections more important, you now open up the opportunity for candidates who otherwise would run as Democrats predominantly in New York to make the decision to run as unaffiliated candidates in the general election. Because despite the importance of primaries, the general elections still get more turnout, and this would increase that turnout further. So while it isn't a nonpartisan election, it certainly opens up the system for a competitive election in which everyone can participate. Now let's talk about the elephant and the donkey in the room, excuse my bad humor, fusion. While the New York City Charter can't get rid of fusion, by opening up a race like this in the general election, parties may be less inclined to cross-endorse. The reason why, if you're, let's say, a conservative candidate or a green candidate, the dominant candidates now have to appeal to you and your constituencies. So there's actually some control over who gets those votes in a ranked choice voting situation. So the Conservative Party or the Green Party candidate can make their case, and the dominant parties then have to appeal. And conversely, because there's no stigma on split voting, some of the people who might feel forced previously into voting for the dominant party candidate may vote for one of the alternative candidates, whether green or conservative, or even an independent candidate, an unaffiliated candidate. So this opens the entire process up. And while it's not quite a nonpartisan election, it is a multi-partisan election in which candidates can choose to run unaffiliated. So that opens the system. So I believe we need to have ranked choice voting in the general elections if we really want a participatory democracy in New York City. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seaman. Mr. Johnson? If you could move the mic over to Mr. Johnson,
Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Frederick Johnson. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I'll admit I know very little about the city charter. So from my perspective, I look at it as it's the Constitution for the city. So.
That is correct.
Thank you.
You know everything.
So I don't have written testimony, but I have two requests since this is an opportunity to amend the city's charter. The first is that we include that the city no longer allow abortion in the city and have that written in the charter, that the city no longer support killing and murdering babies. That's one. The second is term limits for elected officials. I have a recollection that at one time the mayor, I don't know if this is legal, was 2 terms, and I believe under the Mayor Bloomberg's administration it went to 3 terms. I live in City Council District 40, and Matthew Eugene had served 2 terms and then now 3rd terms. Term limits, that be enacted in this next charter revision at the city constitution level. I know that that will do wonders in revitalizing the city and, from my perspective, allowing the kingdom of heaven to come into the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I would note that there currently exists a 2-term limit for all city elected officials, including the mayor, the public advocate, the comptroller, and the city council members, the borough presidents. There's a 2-term limit already in place. Ilya Schwartzberg is next.
May I ask a question? So Council Member Eugene in District 40, my understanding is this is his 3rd term. How did that happen?
We can talk about it later, but I can tell you he was elected in a special election in his 1st term, so that did not count as his term. So he's only had 2 full terms.
Thank you.
The first one just seemed full because he was elected in January.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Schwartzberg?
Yes, thank you. My name is Ilya Schwartzberg, and I'm an officer with the Manhattan Libertarian Party and a committee member of the State Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party is the 3rd largest party nationwide, and after 46 years of fielding candidates, we attained official party status last year in New York State. We are a growing force in the state and the city, and hopefully I can offer the Commission a unique and useful perspective. First, we would ask that if you adopt ranked choice voting, you apply it to general elections. We agree with our colleagues in the Green Party that extending ranked choice voting to general elections makes eminent sense. It will reduce the element of fear-based voting and encourage ideological diversity. This will in turn lead to greater voter engagement. We respectfully but forcefully disagree with Common Cause's new position not to extend ranked choice voting to general elections. Ranked choice voting would actually have a greater force in generals because many voters would not automatically disengage after the primary. Unlike generals today, they would again have real options to consider. Yes, fusion offers a logistical challenge, but this Commission should not ignore that parties such as the Greens and Libertarians exert great efforts to offer real alternatives. To not extend ranked choice voting would be perceived as serving the interests of the Democratic and Republican duopoly instead. We would be encouraging friendly competition in primaries where the major parties' overall interest would be safe, but then insulating the major parties' candidates from third parties in general elections where major parties' interests would be at stake. The party can't lose in a primary, but it can in a general. That would not be fair. Second, another policy is being considered. We would generally endorse the idea of first do no harm. Our city has a housing crisis due to overly restrictive zoning and land use restrictions, which we believe often violate property rights and demonstrably limit the amount of housing available to New Yorkers. Any measures to enhance veto power and obstacles for new developments should be rejected. Streamlining ULURP would be welcome, but not a new veto or any delays. Any comprehensive plan should look to accommodate the market, not mandate a specific vision. It should have to accommodate growth, private planning, and the interests of renters who are most sensitive to supply. We would support diversifying the authority of the CCRB away from the police commissioner to the maximum legal extent. We oppose inscribing into the charter a so-called chief diversity officer under City of Richmond v. Croson. The MWBE program is only constitutionally justified as a remedial program for past discrimination. It would be inappropriate to ascribe it permanently into the city charter. We advocate for the abolition of the public advocate and borough president positions. We oppose guaranteeing any agency's budget, whether independent or not. And finally, we oppose democracy vouchers as compelled political speech.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartzberg. And I have one question, and after that, I'd like us to vote on the minutes from the last meeting.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. To the 2 party officials, there's a kumbaya moment here. I see the 2 parties are in agreement on an important issue. Ranked choice voting. I just want to clarify, are both parties in agreement that you're opposed to Common Cause's position of excluding the general election? You support having ranked choice voting through all elections? Okay. And then,
yes.
Yeah. And then the second question is, you've heard us discuss in previous hearings voter fatigue. For example, Common Cause said limit it to 5 choices. What's your party positions on that? Should there be a limitation on the number of candidates that voters can rank?
Well, the question would really be up to, are we counting fusion candidates as a separate candidate? Each time that they're listed under a party, is that a separate candidate? Because the problem...
I'm sorry, I'm a little lost.
Okay. I believe what Mr. Schwartzberg is saying is that because the way our ballot is structured, you get listed by party. So if you were running, let us say, for city council and you were endorsed by the Republican Party, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and the Green Party, your name would appear 4 different times on the ballot. He's saying, can I vote for you 4 times as a result in ranks voting, or only the 1?
Right, to avoid that kind of gamesmanship, we could do 5 unique candidates or something like that.
I don't feel there should be a limit. Actually, the limit becomes more of a problem in the Democratic primary and the special elections, where you end up having 10 or 15 candidates. In a general election, you're more likely going to get a maximum of the ballot access parties and maybe an unaffiliated candidate or two. So in the general election, there's actually less of a problem. I think someone should be able to vote for all the candidates and avoid exhaustion. But I don't think exhaustion is a problem unless you have a severe limit.
Okay.
I also think that given the city's past precedent, when we had ranked choice voting with proportional representation back in the late 1930s and early 1940s, a candidate was listed on all their endorsed lines. We could go that route, or on the alternative, if the commission is compelled, we could offer having candidates on their respective lines if they appear more than once. But the difference is you don't need to aggregate the votes because, for example, people often think in terms of ideology when they vote that way. So if a candidate were running as Democrat and Working Families Party, perhaps their first vote may be the candidate on Working Families Party, that candidate, but they may transfer their vote to a Green Party candidate or a Republican, Conservative, Libertarian. The transfer may go down to another party. And that at least gives the voter the choice to stick to a consistent ideology, because we've seen the contention, at least in the Working Families Party, when they endorsed on the state level, and it's like, well, which candidate's the more progressive? At least, even if you were to allow each candidate to appear on each line, you would more likely get voters stick to their ideological principles rather than allowing the aggregation, and which also breaks the patronage system. Which
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Before we allow for more questions, I would like to entertain a motion to adopt the minutes of the Commission's hearing on April 30th at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center in Queens, a copy of which is in your little blue pamphlet. Do I hear a motion?
Motion.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The motion carries and the minutes are adopted. You may recall that Commissioner Vaca had expressed a concern that he had not been included, but when we went back and looked both at the video and at the record, he in fact was not at the meeting. So the record from the meeting before stands. Thank you. Are there additional questions for this panel?
No.
I'd like to thank the panel.
Well, I have a question for Mr. Seaman. I just wanted to get your opinion on democracy vouchers, Mr. Seaman.
Personally, I absolutely support it. I think the current finance system, while well-intended, actually creates a big disparity, because if you have a candidate who gets a $2,000 max donation under the system, of which $250 is matchable, that candidate has $4,000 compared to the candidate who's struggling with $10 donations who gets $90 with the matching fund. So you then have potentially up to a 40-to-1 disparity between the well-funded candidate and the candidate who's struggling with $10 donations. Democracy vouchers obliterates that problem because everyone gets the same amount regardless. And most importantly, the Campaign Finance Board said in 2017 there were 27,000 contributors. There are between 4.6 and 5.1 million voters in New York, depending on whether you include inactive and active. If you had 4.6 million voters with the opportunity to contribute without taking money out of their own pocket, that would far outweigh the big money influence.
Thank you very much.
I think you're brilliant.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to thank this panel. And the next panel, we have Linda Moyen. Kylan Greer. I don't know if Nick Rizzo. And Julie Kerr. Ms. Moyen?
Hi, my name is Linda Nguyen, and I'm here representing the New York City Anti-Violence Project, or AVP. We're a crisis organization that serves the LGBTQ and HIV-affected communities, survivors of violence here in New York City. AVP is also a member of Communities United for Police Reform. I'm here to talk about how the city charter revision process can increase police accountability and transparency, and how it can better serve New York City's LGBTQ and HIV-affected survivors of violence. I work with queer and trans communities every day, folks who are navigating multiple systems to survive, the same systems that disproportionately impart violence, material violence, onto our communities. The NYPD is the only agency in New York City that has provided the ability to take someone's life. Less than a month ago, we lost Kowalski Trawick, a member of the LGBTQ community in the Bronx, at the hands of the NYPD. The NYPD needs to be held accountable for all misconduct and killings that happens on their watch. Under the current system, queer and trans survivors of violence are not able to receive the information nor the pathways we need to seek the justice that we want. Rather, we are confronted with a mirage of police secrecy laws and negligence. There needs to be a civilian complaint review board to prosecute cases related to NYPD misconduct and killings, and cases that include school safety agents as well as other peace officers. Further, the public should also be privy to any discrepancies the police commissioner makes that deviates from the CCRB's findings and/or other recommendations. Directly impacted communities deserve the right to know what's going on. We deserve to have a say on how our communities are being policed and surveilled. Under the current system, the public is not able to receive any information on any of the NYPD's private sources of income, nor are we able to receive any information on any major purchases. There must be real oversight and transparency on NYPD fiscal operations. We should be able to know why the NYPD is purchasing equipment and be able to provide input on whether this is something that our communities need. The council should also be able to veto these purchases. Further, militarizing our communities is not safety, it is violence. We need to ensure that directly impacted communities, that LGBTQ survivors of violence and HIV-affected communities are being fully protected by the systems that aim to serve us. AVP supports the Charter Commission priorities laid out by the Communities United for Police Reform in the 2019 ballot. The city needs to take this seriously and require the full accountability and transparency of the NYPD by enacting a CCRB with real power and oversight over the NYPD, as well as school safety agents and peace officers, and require the full accountability and transparency of the NYPD by fully mandating detailed fiscal reports from the agency. Thank you for hearing my testimony today.
Thank you, Ms. Moyen.
It's
And now, is it Kylan Greer?
Yeah, Kylan. My name is Kylan Greer, and I'm the policy manager at Girls for Gender Equity, an organization challenging the structural forces that work to obstruct the freedom, full expression, and rights of girls, transgender, and gender nonconforming youth of color. We work daily with young women and TGNC youth of color who are policed at every juncture of their lives, on the way to school, in their homes, in school, by NYPD school safety agents, and while accessing city services, as seen with Jasmine Headley at the Department of Social Services. Young women and TGNC young people are criminalized for normal adolescent behavior, oftentimes hypersexualized due to historically located racialized and gender-based stereotypes, and their bodies are regularly policed because of their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. Girls for Gender Equity stands with Anna Chambers, an 18-year-old girl who was raped and sexually assaulted by 2 NYPD officers here in Brooklyn, and who is one of many survivors of NYPD gender-based violence against community members, including police sexual violence. These experiences and narratives are often unheard in mainstream media or conversations about policing. This silence exists alongside a multitude of systemic barriers to reporting, survivor supports, and often victim blaming and criminalization of survivors. This is absolutely and unequivocally rooted in racialized and gender-based discrimination. Girls for Gender Equity for almost 20 years have been working alongside young people in every borough, and in particular Brooklyn. For these reasons, we call for the 2019 Charter Revision Commission to consider the following. Please expand the power of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. As a city, we must empower the CCRB to remain a true oversight agency, allowing them to make final discipline determinations in fatal complaints, which they are already able to investigate, and have an expanded purview to include related misconduct and allegations against peace officers. Related in cases that the CCRB does not already prosecute, as is already documented on the public record between the MOU and between the CCRB, the NYPD commissioner should document and make publicly available the reasons for deviating from a CCRB disciplinary recommendation. Girls for Gender Equity also calls for the expansion of the CCRB's authority to explicitly include NYPD school safety agents and other peace officers. As it stands now, young people, when they experience any kind of harm by a school safety agent, they are unable to report it to the CCRB, and it gets referred to the very same officers, the Internal Affairs Bureau of the NYPD, and they're expected to offer a fair case. And I also just want to echo my colleagues' points around the fiscal transparency and units of appropriation of the NYPD. A good example of this is that the NYPD, under a veil of secrecy, launched a drone program that is actually unaccountable to the very communities who pay tax dollars and their incomes. And we really are hopeful that the City Council has veto power over those appropriations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Greer. Next, we have Mr. Rizzo.
Hi there. Thank you, Chair Benjamin and commissioners, for hearing from us today. My name is Nick Rizzo. I'm the Democratic male district leader for the 50th Assembly District, which is Greenpoint and Williamsburg and the Navy Yard. I'm a longtime fan of this body, but a first-time testifier. I really like what you're doing here. Honestly, that this is one of the most open and transparent governmental changes in the history of this city, and you really should be applauded for this. Normally city government is not this accountable, I think, and so there's something really incredible. We have the opportunity to do something really incredible here. I'd like to speak on 3 topics today, please. The first one, and the most important one, is ranked choice voting. Please, please pass ranked choice voting. The staff laid out a series of good questions. Which types of elections should be subject to RCV? All of them. I'd like to join the Libertarian and Green Party representatives in saying that. It should apply to the general too. It should apply to all municipal offices. Implementation should begin in 2021. There shouldn't be a hybrid system, and there should be more than 3 candidates must be available for ranking. Ideally 5, but why say at least 5, I would say, if I were in your position. And I'd also like to point out that the other election recommendations, election-related recommendations and redistricting-related recommendations are really good too. We need more time. Someone winning a special election should be able to have more time. We've got this absurd situation in the council to replace Giummani, where there's a special election followed immediately by a primary. They were petitioning at the same time. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the Public Advocate's Office. We need to beef it up a little, and I think the recommendations here are really strong. Though I guess Giummani doesn't want the Department of Investigation. Go figure. The third thing that I'd like to say is a sort of broader strategic or tactical point, which is I think the staff has done such an excellent job laying out recommendations. I don't want to agree with every single one of them in the whole report, but the vast majority. This is probably the last charter revision commission for a number of years. So many good ideas have been laid out, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. I urge you to be ambitious. I urge you to pass at least 5 different things that people will be voting on in packages, and I urge you to be bold and mindful. Thank you. Mindful of which ones are controversial and which ones aren't. I think we all want to see this commission be a success, and I think obviously that's not going to happen unless the voters approve these proposed changes. And so some will be controversial, some will be not, some will be solitary, and some will be omnibus. But I think together, this commission is going to do a really amazing thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rizzo. Ms. Kerr?
Yes, thank you. Good evening. My name is Julie Kerr, and I'm here to voice my support of ranked choice voting. I am a member of Brooklyn Voters Alliance, an all-volunteer grassroots community group that, in addition to promoting voter participation and education, works to protect and expand voting rights in New York State. Fortunately, we and other voting reform activists around the state saw some important steps forward this year when a series of new voting laws, including early voting, were passed by the state legislature. Really the first update to New York's voting laws in more than 100 years. These new laws affect the entire state. Ranked choice voting is something that New York City can do to move the needle forward in improving its elections for city offices. After all, New York City has a voting problem. We don't show up at the polls, and certainly not for city elections. In 2017, barely more than 21% of registered New York City voters voted in the city elections that year. In the primary of that year, it was even less, about 18%. Special elections see even a lower turnout. February's special election for public advocates saw about 8% voter turnout. And while there isn't one silver bullet reform that will turn the tide in favor of voter participation, ranked choice voting, along with some of the recently passed state reforms, could, I hope, see those trends start to reverse themselves. Using ranked choice voting to conduct city elections, all city elections, meaning citywide, city council, and borough president, could encourage voters to view our elections in a different light. Instead of having to choose between the lesser of two evils or staying home altogether because they don't believe their candidate of choice has a real shot at winning, by allowing voters to rank candidates for an office in their order of preference, and that their second choice vote still counts if their first choice receives the fewest number of votes, ranked choice voting can be an important incentive for voters to remain engaged in the process through Election Day. It means whoever is elected has a consensus of the constituency that elected official will represent. I would hope to see ranked choice voting used beginning in the city's 2021 elections. At the very least, it should be used in all primary and special elections. Again, ranked choice voting should apply to all citywide, city council, and borough president elections. With 2/3 of citywide offices and about 70% of the city council seats term limited out in 2021, it's safe to bet that, based on past city elections, at least 2/3 of these races will seek 3 or more candidates running in the seats for the primaries. Let voters use ranked choice voting to elect our representatives who we look to make important decisions on our behalf. I urge the Commission to include ranked choice voting in its final recommendations and allow it to be put before the voters of New York City this November to decide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kerr. Are there any questions? Thank you. The next panel I have is Ellen Belofsky, Mariam from Make the Road, New York, Jed Holtz, and Elias Holtz. Ms. Belofsky, if you'd like to start.
Good evening. My name is Ellen Belofsky. I'm a Brooklyn resident, and I want to speak in support of ranked choice voting from my own perspective as a concerned voter. I'm supporting ranked choice voting in New York City very simply because I believe that elections should be about voting for the candidate you think will do the best job in the office, and should not be a gambling game requiring voters to calculate the odds on which candidate has the best chance to win. Our current electoral system all too often allows situations such as the recent public advocate race, where the vote is split among many candidates, allowing someone with a minority of votes to win with a plurality. With ranked choice voting, we could vote for our preferred candidate without worrying that our vote would spoil someone else's chances to be elected or steal votes for him or her. If my first choice candidate doesn't receive sufficient votes and is eliminated, then my second or third choice vote will be counted, but my actual preference will also have been heard. The winner is someone who actually receives a majority of the votes counted. Whether or not that person was the first choice of all the voters, the majority of the voters voted for that winner. Ranked choice voting would have been helpful for the people of New York when we had some 17 candidates running for public advocate earlier this year, splitting the vote. Ranked choice voting would help the voters of my own city council district right now when we have some 7 or 8 candidates running in yet another special election for city council member in District 45. This shows that we need ranked choice voting for all elections in New York City, not just citywide elections. I also support giving New Yorkers the opportunity to rank their top 5 candidates at a minimum to make sure all ballots will count in races such as these with many candidates. Ranked choice voting has been introduced successfully elsewhere around the country, and New York City has the opportunity to help pave the way for improving our voting system nationwide. I believe ranked choice voting will encourage more voters to turn out because they know their votes will count. It will strengthen our elections and our democracy. I support ranked choice voting because voting should be about expressing a preference for the best candidate and not about gaming the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Belofsky. Mariam?
Good evening. My name is Miriam, and I'm a youth leader with Make the Road New York, a member organization of the citywide coalition.
Excuse me, Mariam, can you speak more closely into the microphone?
Communities United for Police Reform. I am here to talk about increasing accountability for NYPD school safety agents by expanding the CCRB's scope of investigation authority to cover complaints against safety agents. Right now in New York City, there is no public accountability process to hold safety agents accountable for misconduct and abuse. The only real process youth have to go through is the Internal Affairs Bureau, something that is very intimidating for youth and their families and relies on internal accountability, which we know often means no accountability. Oftentimes, at the end of that process, SSAs are simply transferred to another school and not actually held accountable by the NYPD. The need to have better and public ways of holding SSAs accountable is clear when the NYPD doesn't even hold officers accountable for killing people, like in the case of Eric Garner, where 5 years have passed and no officers have been disciplined. For youth in New York City schools, SSAs are often the first point of contact and are often the ones in school who make us feel most unsafe. From the moment young black girls walk into school, from the moment young black girls walk into school, we have to go through invasive policing. SSAs will request young women to remove head wraps, pins, and even bras that may have wires. Agents often assume the worst of young people and create environments where we are no longer students and can't get our education with respect and dignity. On top of that, SSAs never think what they're doing is wrong. And even when they are told directly that they boost an air of confidence, knowing that they will get away with whatever actions they commit. Black and brown youth are among the most vulnerable to the violence committed by SSAs. In New York City, black girls are 10.4 times more likely to be arrested by SSAs. The main line used by NYPD is that young people are dangerous, and that's why we need police in our schools. But what happens when the people sent to keep us safe are the very ones harming us and walking around with impunity? We can't continue to live in a city where the people who are allegedly responsible for our safety are the most of our... We can't continue to live in a city where the people who are allegedly responsible for our safety, for the safety of our communities, We can't continue to live in a city where people who are allegedly responsible for the safety of our most vulnerable populations continue to harm folks and not be held accountable. Expanding CCRB authority to specifically include SSA and other peace officers who operate under the direction of the NYPD is one step to ending the school-to-prison pipeline and providing safety and justice to youth of color in New York City schools. This offers an opportunity to provide actual safety to youth in our schools and make them feel heard and respected. This is why Make the Road New York supports this expansion as a priority along with other priorities laid out by CPR. And we hope you do too. Thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Jed Holtz.
Good evening. My name's Jed Holtz. I'm the New York City organizer for the Freedom Socialist Party, but tonight I'm here on behalf of the legislative working group of the Campaign for an Elected Civilian Review Board. I'm here in response to questions that were both raised at Tuesday's Queens hearing as well as those in the preliminary staff report as to the legality of the reform which we have put forward for an elected civilian review board. And that proposal has been spoken to many times and supported by many throughout this process, as you know. As we testified and supported and submitted to you in writing last year, we have specific legal research that says the creation of an elected civilian review board does not violate state law or the collective bargaining rights of officers, and that it in fact needs to happen through a charter amendment. We disagree with the assertion that this amendment is not within the box you are operating within as charter amenders. In fact, there's no other box other than charter amendment that this can happen. It needs to happen through a charter amendment. The charter is the body of law that vests power in the commissioner to enact discipline over police. Changing that is the only way to change the reality in which the commissioner has complete power over disciplinary decisions. This is the root of the crisis, which many have spoken to, and what needs to be changed through a charter amendment. For police discipline, the charter giveth, and the charter taketh away. New York State civil service law, in fact, backs that up, which addresses the state question. It empowers local authorities to determine discipline as outlined in Section 75 of Civil Service Law, quote, "The hearing upon such charges shall be held by the officer or body having the power to remove the person against whom such charges are preferred." In that way, civil service law explicitly acknowledges that a governmental body, such as the proposed ECRB, can have disciplinary authority. To the question, would an elected civilian review board infringe on police officers' rights to collective bargaining? No. The ECRB would not change their collective bargaining rights. Police officers are already precluded by law from addressing disciplinary procedure in contract negotiations. The case of New York City versus McDonald in '94 found that disciplinary procedures as outlined in the Charter Amendment and Administrative Code cannot be superseded by contract demands. Our legislation amends the commissioner's authority, but he remains intact to carry out the decisions of the elected civilian review board. It's not at the state level, it is in the charter. We submit to you for the second time research, that outlines these points which I am raising here. There's enough copies for you all to read it. After months of this process, though, it seems to us that these rather vague legal questions are a completely inadequate excuse for inaction in the face of a major moral crisis. Prove us wrong and honor the public outcry by putting a real solution on the ballot with an elected civilian review board, or cave to the status quo in which police officers commit murder, assault, and rape with no consequences. The choice is yours.
Excuse me. Thank you. Elias Holtz.
Thank you. My name is Elias Holtz. I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party, and I'm a steering committee member of the Elected Civilian Review Board campaign. I'm compelled to join the long list of people testifying for effective community organizing over the police, in part because of the 18 years I've been a social justice and anti-war activist. I've witnessed countless incidents of police harassment and assault on people simply demanding their First Amendment rights. I testified for an elected and empowered civilian review board and independent prosecutor to the Mayor's Charter Commission nearly 1 year ago today. They passed the buck on taking action, but that's no surprise given that our mayor has consistently sided with the NYPD, even in the face of a staggering amount of violence and corruption by the department. With your staff report and excuses that state law prevent you from taking action, it seems at least some of you have taken the side of inaction. And when it comes to the police, there really are only two sides. On one side, you have a belligerent, violent, and completely unchecked police force defended by politicians and the laws they hold up as excuses. And on the other side are the people suffering and left defenseless to the violence and abuse of their own police force. Some of you have made your choice whose side you're on. Others maybe haven't yet. We welcome you to fight with us. If you follow your staff report instead of standing up for real police reform, you're choosing instead to change the window dressing on a burning house. Making the police commissioner issue more reports doesn't take away his absolute power. And that is the main problem, that the police are allowed to police themselves and do essentially that and do whatever they want. No one in the government stands up to them. We know that the police union will fight any tiny bit of police reform with tooth and nail. Our campaign is not afraid of them. We know our solution for an elected review board and independent prosecutor is legally sound in state and city law. More importantly, it is morally righteous, and it's what the public wants. If you pass on bringing community oversight of the NYPD to voters, you in effect do the PBA's dirty work for them. Yet another instance where the PBA holds our government hostage. We are angry. I don't think you understand how angry we are. Daniel Pantaleo makes 6 figures after using a deadly illegal chokehold, and Eric Garner is 6 feet under. You may choose to do nothing, many before you have, but we have no such choice. The reality cannot be endured. We are not going away until we win community oversight of our police department. We will keep coming back, and we will fight until we win. Thank you.
Please. Are there any questions? Thank you very much. The next speakers are Kathleen Daniel, Michael Kangmana, Daniela Liebling, who spoke yesterday, didn't you? Tuesday, I'm sorry. And Mark Fleidner.
For them, or can I just start?
Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Daniel.
Yes. Good evening. Kathleen Daniel, born, bred, and boldly Brooklyn, and thank you for taking the time to be here tonight and allow us to speak to this process, which is really the spirit, I think, of Brooklyn and where we should be heading. There can be no conversation about voting and election reform without safety. Across this country, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men have experienced stalking. That's according to the data from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Address confidentiality programs, known as ACP for Address Confidentiality Program, ensure that survivor information stays safe from abusers. and must be included in the city charter. What is the point of talking about voter registration in different languages and access to translators if we cannot go to the polls and vote safely? As a domestic violence survivor, I know what it's like to run for your life. And if we run for our lives, we leave everything behind, including our voter registration card. 39 states have programs already, and New York City, the Empire City, the center of the universe, like here in Brooklyn, we're far behind. Sanctuary cities must also be safe havens for survivors to exercise their civil right to vote. Section 1054 of the Charter, the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee, Part B, Item 2, we should add, including but not limited to survivors of domestic, intimate partner violence, and violent crime. Section 3, we should be adding when they discuss city agencies and that the commission, the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee must reach out to city agencies. It lists a plethora of them, but it does not include the family justice centers. It should be included. We should include, create a working group, 50% of which should be survivors. If you've never been to DMV and waited in the line, you're really not qualified to talk about reforms. The same goes for survivors of violence and intimate partner violence. 50% of the working group should be survivors to review processes for voter registration, absentee ballots, voting, and privacy, and make recommendations to the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee. We should also include that the Board of Election offices should have all of the available languages for voter registration cards in their office. I called today. I called in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. They couldn't figure out where I could, in the month of May, Haitian Heritage Month, where to get a Creole language voter registration card. I have to order it. An individual is not going to go and order it. The one thing that should be really easy to do is to exercise my civil right to vote. I urge you to include these items in the city charter. Please do not force survivors to choose between safety and their civil right to vote. There are women who are citizens in this city. You know them, you ride the bus with them, you see them when you drop your children off to school, because what does a survivor look like? It looks like you and me. This is who we are. We are everywhere. There are people who are allowed by law to vote, but disallowed by the controlling person in their family, in their home, to exercise the right the law affords them. Please do not leave them out of the discussion. Do not look at reforming a process that doesn't make it safe for everyone eligible to participate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Daniel. Mr. King Mana?
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Michael Kangmana. Prior to this year, I was a high school special education teacher in New York City Public Schools. Though I'm here today speaking on behalf of Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network, which is a group of organizations fighting against the waves of gentrification here in Brooklyn and across the city. There are many components of the charter revision being proposed, but I'd like to specifically focus on land use. While there are some small aspects of this revision that attempt to try to give more of a voice to local communities, the proposed amendments continue to fail to give New York City residents the power they truly need to stand up for themselves and their communities. I and New Yorkers all across the city find it abhorrent that all of these changes are being proposed, and yet community boards are still not being given the actual power to vote on land use actions. For too long, the votes granted to community boards have been advisory, and for the most part dismissed in the larger scheme of development across New York City. It makes no sense that the one group of people who do not get a vote that actually counts when it comes to land use decisions throughout the city are the people who actually live in the neighborhoods where rezonings and development are being proposed. The fact that this charter revision fails to grant this basic power and right to communities across the city shows how our elected and appointed officials continue to disregard the voices of New York City residents. Additionally, the fact that all community board seats are still not elected positions within each community is problematic. The charter revision is looking to grant longer terms for some community board members, which will perpetuate a trend of stacking community boards with people who are proponents of development that serve the interests of those who can afford the rising prices that come with development, rather than the interests of people who actually live in those communities. We demand that all community board positions become elected positions and that every community board is granted a right to vote, a vote that has the power to veto any land use action a community deems harmful or not in the best interest of the people who live there. Until our local government makes sure that community boards are democratically run, so as to truly be voices of communities, and the community boards are given actual power and an actual seat at the table when it comes to land use decisions throughout the city, New York City residents will continue to suffer from displacement, homelessness, rising rents, closings of small businesses, and the tearing apart of communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingmana. The next speaker is Ms. Liebling.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Daniela Liebling, and I did testify Tuesday night as a member of the Green Party, and I'm compelled to testify again tonight as a member of myself, as a Brooklyn resident. Many of my friends who saw that I testified on Tuesday begged me to come back and explain that I now represent many, many other people who couldn't be here tonight, and I'm actually amazed that there isn't more notification about this event and the ones that came before it, like on New York One, announcements and things like that. And it goes to show to me how disenfranchised our public is from civic engagement. And I think that, and I want everyone here to know that all the causes that you are here tonight representing could be solved very much with ranked choice voting, which was what I'm here to talk about. There are symptoms of problems, and then there are cures to problems, and ranked choice voting can be one of the biggest cures to all the problems that everybody here tonight is worried about, and I agree with almost every single person here. And that's why we have to have ranked choice voting for the general elections as well as all the other elections. We have to. That is the only way to really democratize the system. And we have an extremely corrupt system. And as everyone here knows, we have 12 years to solve the climate crisis. And Democrats and Republicans have not done it. And they're not going to do it unless we push them with everything that we have. And the one big thing that we have is to get ranked choice voting so that we can have a really competitive process where our candidates push hard on the issues that are life and death, like climate change is. And I have a 13-year-old son, and I am not about to go down allowing a corrupt electoral system and a corrupt legal system, political system, cause my son to suffer catastrophic climate change in his near future. This isn't 100 years away, it's not 200. It's in our lifetimes, the people sitting in this room, and in the lifetimes of the kids that are children. And it's unconscionable that we have a political and electoral system that is just happy to have big donors and wealthy people influencing who makes decisions about what. And it's about time we change it. And you all have the power. You all have incredible power to make a huge, amazing difference in the lives of every New Yorker. And because New York is the city of the world, you have the power then to start a domino effect on the entire country. And I really hope you take that seriously and don't just do a little tweaky fix of special elections and primaries. Really go for the gusto and take the bold. You wanted bold last time on Tuesday. It will be more bold than you can ever imagine, but you have to do it the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Liebling. Mark Fleidner?
It's Fleidner, but no
Fleidner.
worries.
I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right. Good evening. I am here as a concerned New Yorker, but I have a unique context for my interest in one of the particular topics that's already been touched upon by some of my new friends, and that is modifications to the charter that will provide for an elected civilian review board. I have a unique context for my interest in this topic. I was the inaugural chief of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office Civil Rights Bureau from 2014 to 2016. I daily reviewed cases of alleged police misconduct, allegations of very serious police misconduct, for investigation and potential prosecution. I heard over and over again from witnesses, overwhelmingly young witnesses from communities black and brown, that they had no interest and were not considering engaging in the CCRB process because they were aware that ultimate decisions of accountability were made by the police commissioner. And they believed that CCRB's lack of independence and autonomy in investigating and proceeding with these allegations of misconduct rendered it toothless at best, useless at worst. That's a big problem for the city when, as your report eloquently stated, there are few, if any, ways in which government interaction with a person can have a greater effect on that person's life than an interaction with police. The specific prospect of elected review boards captured my attention when I spoke in 2015 in California as a panelist at the annual conference of NACOL, that's the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, where I found that much of the discussion centered around burgeoning national recognition of the need for true, credible autonomy in such oversight. Now, I was heartened to see that the report recognized that the structure of the board was an issue to be carefully addressed by the commission. The current manner in which the board members are selected, with the council designating 5 members is obviously rendered meaningless with the mayor's ability to reject all of them if she or he so chooses. The mayor picks the chair, the mayor controls the police commissioner. The police commissioner decides on office accountability. The police commissioner controls the department, and everybody on the street gets it. We have no voice in this process. It can't stand. I was, however, disheartened when I saw the Commission's proposed solutions. One suggestion, the public advocate has 1 vote on the Commission. That's not going to make any significant impact. And then there was what I perceived to be a vague statement in the report that said the complexity of various legal structures, including state law, make other alternative recommendations impossible. I disagree and seek clarification of the committee's position on that. Bottom line, this is a city issue that impacts the residents of this city. It is an issue of constitutional proportions. It can and should be addressed by this body. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for this panel? Thank you very much, and I appreciate your testimony. As you know, we'll be discussing it. Ms. Liebling's heard us on Tuesday, going through some of the discussion afterwards, so thank you. The next speakers will be Robin Strauss, Anna Santiago, Quinn Raymond, and Gina Arias. Is Quinn Raymond not here any longer? Okay. Ray Curry? Okay. Ms. Strauss.
Thank you. My name is Robin Strauss, and I'm a social worker. I've been practicing and teaching social work for 40-plus years in New York City. And one of my first positions as a social worker was on a mobile geriatric team where we visited older people in their homes, people that were suffering from mental illness and other kinds of functional disorders of old age. And at the time that I was in this position, Eleanor Bumpers was killed by Officer Stephen Sullivan in 1987. Eleanor Bumpers was decompensating. She was scared. She didn't feel safe in her home, but she wanted to stay in her home. And she needed time, she needed support, and she needed safety. She represented at that time, and still represents the most vulnerable people at the hands of police violence. She's an older, poor, black woman living with mental illness in public housing. She was killed by Stephen Sullivan. 2 shots, the first one to her hand, and the second one, 9 pellets in her chest that killed her. The police were and they are untrained to deal with matters of mental illness. And they get scared and they shoot. And I have talked to many police officers in my experience as a social worker doing mobile visits, crisis visits, who say they get no training and they shoot. And they shoot when they feel there is aggression in front of them that they don't understand. They shoot. Officer Sullivan was indicted, but he was acquitted. But everyone else paid. Eleanor Bumpers paid with her life. Her family, communities throughout New York City paid by having to live with the trauma of a violent police killing. Trauma affects all communities. And an individual is shot, but the communities hold the emotionality of that trauma. So there are multiple layers of this issue. This is police, violence, unaccountability, trauma, and communities that are holding this, suffering from it, people who can't develop normatively because of it, and mental health issues just go on and on and on. The taxpayers paid $200,000 in the civil suit. We're still paying, but we're paying millions now. The taxpayers pay. And the social service workers that really tried to approach this issue were demoted. And they were told that their judgment wasn't good. But Stephen Sullivan got off, like so many police officers get off and are not held accountable.
Could you sum up?
I can go on with names and narratives. We hold our posters up. There's Eleanor Bumpers' face. Look at it. We hold it up. We've held it up to you. We've been told to keep it below our chin. It's hard. It's painful to look at the truth. The truth is these were innocent people, many of whom are living with mental illness, black and brown folk, queer folk, homeless people who get shot because the police just react. That's all they do. Now, I joined the campaign for an elected civilian review board, and I just want to say this is a great campaign. It's an excellent campaign. We have really smart people on this campaign from all over the city who do all kinds of things for work and who live in this city and know what's going on. They know the truth, okay? We put together a team, a legislative team, that researched and worked together to come up with a very logical, legally sound legislation, a proposal that we were hoping you would read, take seriously, look at, okay, that could replace the structure of replace the CCRB. Because as so many people have talked tonight, the CCRB is, it holds no ability to hold police accountable. And
Ms. Strauss, could you begin to sum up, please?
Sum up, yeah. Okay, I'm going to just sum up by talking about, I need another minute, my response to the staff report. Very, very angry and disgusted with the response, with your response to us. You reduced our comprehensive and well-researched proposal to some crumbs that aren't going to work, and a one-sided debate having to do with fabricated issues of state laws interfering with local laws and consequences unintended of collective bargaining. We've done our homework. The Holtz men have shared tonight our understanding, clarity on this. And we know there is no conflict here. This is the end.
Thank you.
But you persist. you persist to return to this issue at every hearing, time and again, with defensive weaponry, sword and shield, if you like, ways to control the debate, turn a deaf ear to our progressive reform that the city, the people in this city need and they support. And it makes us wonder, who are you listening to? Who is holding you hostage? Who are you aligned with? Because you have turned your backs on a very important proposal and the people who come hearing after hearing to support our proposal.
Thank you. Ms. Santiago?
Good evening to everyone here. I am a parent and a grandparent who resides in East New York. I would like to share with you tonight an incident that occurred some years ago. This tragic incident is just one of many that my family and other families are experiencing at the hands of police officers who are behaving worse than criminals. Yes, it is true that not all officers are behaving badly, but all too often, even the good officers feel powerless to intervene when their fellow officers are behaving criminally. East New York has the highest complaints against officers. I believe, along with those who are calling for the dismantling of the CCRB and replacing it with the ECRB that is elected, empowered, and with special independent prosecutor should become reality to hold criminally acting officers accountable for terrorizing citizens. As I mentioned before, that I will share an incident that I have never shared before. One afternoon, my son arrived from school and confided in me that he was feeling suicidal. My sweet 12-year-old child was experiencing a medical crisis. As any normal parent would do, I called for EMS. I felt powerless in not knowing how to help him. Somehow, I knew that the professionals knew and trusted that my son would be safe once they arrived. Unfortunately, EMS arrived after the police arrived. The police who arrived entered my home as though they were arriving to an active crime scene. Immediately, I knew that things were not going to go well. As the officer who took the lead opened his mouth to speak to my 12-year-old child, he said, "Put your clothes on." The tone and anger in his body language was unbelievable. I immediately knew that I, the parent of my child, was no longer in control in the protection of my 12-year-old child. When my son refused because he was scared and confused and he is experiencing a mental health crisis, the officer said, "Look, I don't like you and you don't like me, but you better hurry and get your clothes on." I was appalled that an officer who came in to supposedly help a 12-year-old child get to the emergency room would be treating him in this manner. Fast forward to the emergency room, the officer had my child in handcuffs, didn't allow me to ride with him in the ambulance. As I waited for my son to receive medical treatment, this officer jeered at my child. He laughed and made jokes about my child, all in my presence. I asked another officer, "Why is he doing this?" "We are not criminals. All I wanted was to get my 12-year-old son help." That female officer looked down to the floor and just shrugged her shoulders as she walked away, leaving us to be terrorized by a tyrant who had the authority over us. I was just concerned for my son that night. I didn't know or understand what my rights and child's rights were. So I lived all these years with shame because of how that officer made me feel. I couldn't save my child who was ill from a tyrant. I live in fear of bad police officers and in fear that the good ones feel powerless to hold them immediately accountable during their interaction with citizens. Another son who is who has his own family, also lives in fear that a bad cop can remove him from society, but most importantly, remove him from his family. Please do what is right and stand behind the ECRB.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curry?
Hi. The last time I was here was 1992, and I think that's the date on the charter I own. I got in New York in 1967 to do a master's degree, and what I learned was the opportunity embedded in disinvestment, displacement, planned shrinkage, and more recently, catastrophic resolution. And they remain just as destructive and profitable today. It'd be a lot better if my glasses were on. As the 87 revision process ended, and by the way, when we were here, this room was not this spectacular, believe me. Today, the problems are a lot quieter and possibly desperate. There's a different housing, rent, and transit disasters, are unfolding into the climate C crisis. Can we say we didn't see it coming? We now know ranked choice voting expresses the will of the people in a quick way, and I know you will recommend it for elections, all of our elections, because it strengthens the problem-solving talents of those who seek leadership. The 89 revision was bold, it was unique, it was powerful. But it was emerging from a hideous 25-year disinvestment in the engine that is the creativity of the people who live in this city. We saw a voice rise from neighborhoods that expressed the exquisite self-interest, legitimate fears, and pressing concerns of ordinary people, making localized governments and democratic elections even juicier seems to me to be a beautiful thing to try and make happen. We shouldn't betray that tradition. Whether fair share is up or down, 197A is useful or not, the participation of unlikely voices has grown because you are listening to be heard. The thing is to turn it to power. You have to be bold. Our charter is a living, good listening thing. There are no originalists in this city. Power and privilege cannot defeat truth and justice. You have to be bold. People know me for saying that no one is as smart as all of us. The skills for this feat should be part of every agency's staff training from community boards to the mayor. And you should believe in old planners' instincts. The need for continuous improvement in the responsiveness of government has never been higher. Be bold. Campaign finance did not destroy incumbents. Voters want civic engagement and support, and they're still waiting for it. Board turnover sharpens staff training skills at the City Planning Commission. Last paragraph. Let me close by posing one question for reflection. Should this work, this hard work, be so easy? Scholarly references on the 1989 revision are on policy reversals, new approaches, uniqueness, and weakness. And the information offers us a laser focus on the damage that government is likely to do to ordinary people. Divisions like have and have not now include knowing and unknowing. And in that age, the haves are not the only ones that know now. My work with Represent Us and I think partnering with Common Cause believes that the least the charter revision should do is to find hope in the dark. And I would urge you to have your staff read and digest a little 3-hour read book, Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, and have them read it before the end of the July deadlines. It will give them courage and will help them see through some of the fog that the participants here have been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gina Arias?
Hi, yes, my name is Gina Arias, and I was born in Queens. I live in Brooklyn, and before I begin, I just want to say thank you to this woman for, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but for talking to us and telling us about that horrible experience that you went through. I want to go off my script just a little bit to say that even though I've been in the city here for 20 years, I grew up in a white community in Long Island where I never saw police. I never heard anyone complain about police misconduct. We never saw police. They just didn't come around. We could be lighting fireworks illegally, and it happened every 4th of July. Never saw police. So when I came back to the city, because I was born in Queens, I was shocked to see the things that we do see in our community. So one of the things that I have never seen in the time that I've been here is a CCRB with enough muscle and power to be an effective, to do its job effectively. People in my community won't go to the CCRB if they even know that it exists because, to go and lodge valid complaints about police misconduct because in many ways, as we've heard over and over again tonight, CCRB is a paper tiger, okay? And this has to change. So, what we have in the CCRB is the nation's largest independent oversight agency of the nation's largest police force. So, they should have more authority, okay? I'm here as an individual, but before I read my testimony, I do want to say that I fully support the reforms being demanded by Communities United for Police Reform. And what I'd like to focus on today are changes to the city charter that enable the CCRB to determine discipline in cases that they prosecute, changes that expand the CCRB authority to explicitly include school safety officers. Okay, our children, and we heard very eloquently from the sister from Make the Road, that, our children don't have much recourse when they're in the schools. Okay, these are things I never had to think about when I was in school. I would like the changes to expand the CCRB to prosecute on other misconduct. For example, when officers provide false statements or lie on official reports. And lastly, I would like to say that changes should require that when the NYPD commissioner deviates on CCRB findings and discipline recommendations, that the reason for the deviation be made public. The NYPD should not be operating as if it's some sort of fiefdom, okay, and that's what we have. I believe that at a minimum, New Yorkers deserve more transparency with regard to a department that is there, that exists to serve the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of this panel? Thank you very much.
I have a question. Where do we give our written testimony?
Oh, you can give it to any one of the staff who were there. The next group is Stephen Smith, Elmo Doig, Richard Van Auken, and Frank Morano. Frank, are you still? Yes, I see you. The hour is getting later. As you can see, we are going to go through all of the slips that we have, but if more people are arriving, we may not get to them tonight. I know that's you, Frank, and your name, sir? Stephen. You're Stephen Smith? Okay, so Richard Van Auken, A-U-K-E-N, if I'm pronouncing it wrong. He left? Okay. And Mr. Doig, Elmo Doig? He left too? Okay. Sandy Hornick, step right up. And Ralph Yozo? Okay, Stephen?
Yes, hello. A few weeks ago, I watched city officials testify City planning officials testify that no changes are needed to the city's land use review process because the current system is working just fine. The charter review discourse has been very heavy on things that would make it probably harder to build housing, so I understand why they said that, but they are wrong. The current system is not working fine. Last year, New York City permitted housing at a slower rate than Baltimore. This is all housing, market rate and affordable. New York is consistently in the bottom of big cities in terms of units permitted per capita, and we have the ever-accelerating housing cost to show for it. What this region desperately needs is for the state to step in, as states on the West Coast have been, and force municipalities, especially in the suburbs, to permit more housing. That is not within this commission's purview, but setting housing permitting targets is for the city. I know that's not the kind of comprehensive planning that a lot of people have been talking about, but it's what we need. The city desperately needs housing production targets. They should not be tied to population growth. Population growth can be stopped or even reversed with underproduction of housing, as we've seen in many wealthy Manhattan neighborhoods, and last year in the city as a whole. Instead, production targets should be tied to market rents and aimed at keeping them stable or at least reversing them. I know, the majority of people in this city are not market renters or market housing buyers, but almost everybody is at one point. All rent stabilized housing units were at one point market rate housing units. People are paying the market rates plus allowed increases. So long as rents are trending ever upwards, the city should be made to revise its housing growth targets upwards. This could be enforced through the Board of Standards and Appeals. If an applicant's rezoning application is rejected and growth targets are not met, they should be able to use this as evidence at a BSA hearing. Having a quasi-judicial body step in and approve housing permits is done in Toronto with the Ontario Municipal Board and in New Jersey with Mount Laurel court cases. Both do a much better job of keeping rents affordable than New York does, and these are successful ideas worth emulating. I've heard that this commission doesn't feel it has the capacity to suggest changes like this or comprehensive planning to the city charter. Even if you don't feel you can suggest something binding, I would strongly suggest you do something. You suggest at least something advisory so that the next time a charter review commission is impaneled, they better understand the magnitude of the work ahead of them to fix that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Sandy?
Good evening. Thank you for being patient. Listen to all these folks tonight. My name is Sandy Hornick, and I'm an urban planner now in private practice. But for 38 years, I was an employee of or consultant to the Department of City Planning. I would love to address the previous topic, but it's not really on the table for today. I'd like to address how the ULURP and pre-ULURP process might be revised and how to best encourage planning that takes place in the context of the best possible balance of citywide and local concerns. As currently structured, the ULURP process is intended to give communities meaningful voice, but not authority, which often means that sooner or later, everyone is frustrated. But I believe that is by design. The public can only voice its opinion, or, as is often the case, opinions, and hope that its reasoning resonates or its numbers overwhelm. Community board members give freely of their time, but their recommendations are only advisory. Staff at the public agencies has the luxury of being paid for its time, but no voice in the decision-making process. The Planning Commission neither develops proposals nor controls the final decision-making. The City Council has final decision-making authority, but does not control what comes before them. And not that they are the subject of much sympathy, but private applicants often feel that they must invest substantial time and money in a process with no certainty other than the ULURP timeline, and that they're at the mercy of everyone else in the process. This is generally a messy process, but one that is designed to promote balance. I believe this is generally good and should, generally speaking, not be changed. I do think community boards are at a disadvantage, however, because while they get 60 days to review ULURP calendar, the interaction of the dates of certification with the calendars of community boards often means that community boards effectively have less than their allotted time to do the review. Changes in ULURP that promote advance notice may be workable without adding too much difficulty to the process. Changes should try to change the carefully crafted balance among the various participants in the process are likely to cause more problems than that they would solve. On balancing the citywide and local concerns, I want to say that the staff report that does an admirable job in highlighting and explaining the 12 planning documents. And while all these documents do not address the same issues, This is just too many documents. The process needs to be simplified. Planning and planning issues are not static. New York is, fortunately, a dynamic place, and a consequence, the city is constantly confronting evolving issues as the city reinvents itself. The history of the past 30 years of requiring all these reports is not that these mandated and extensive processes remain precise guidance documents for the future. As an example, Plan NYC was an innovative document that focused the city on a host of issues that the city would confront. But the issues did not stay the same, and the arrival of a new administration with new and revised policies inherently changed the emphasis and sometimes the recommendations of the plan. There should be fewer planning documents, and they should focus on identifying important issues and priority for planning and broad strategies to address them, rather than detailed prescriptions of specific actions. They cannot be expected to detail specific proposals that do not yet exist, such as what future rezonings are needed or where specifically they should be. Even if this could be done, it would run counter to the desire for meaningful local engagement, which is the Commission's consideration, informing the Commission's consideration of the pre-ULURP process. As this Commission considers potential revisions, I would encourage you to also consider the temporal implications of all these reports. Obviously, they take a lot of time and allocation of limited resources to prepare. But it's important to consider that governance commences with inauguration. Reports that take years to prepare, especially when based on other reports that also needed to be prepared, will automatically be completed well into the, and perhaps at the end of the term. This was the case with the only planning and zoning report that took years to prepare and was actually issued after the Dinkins administration was voted out of office. These mandated reports are most likely to affect the administration that prepares them, and the more detailed they have to be and the more complicated process of making them means that they will take more time to prepare and therefore have less impact on that administration. The following implement may share the same goals as its predecessors, but more frequently it wants to show that it is different. Charter mandated reports have proved an ineffective tool to mandating an agenda of a subsequent administration. And then I just want to say one personal thing. If you're going to do ranked choice voting, as a voter, please don't give me more than 3 choices. It's just mind-numbing to think that people are going to have giant ballots and have to choose between 5 or 10 choices going down a ballot. It's just not the way humans, other than the political junkie class, operates.
Thank you, Cindy. I'll have a question for you later about the question about that. Frank?
Good evening. You know, there's certain movies, certain television shows that you have a pretty good idea of how they're going to end, even if you haven't seen them before, maybe even just on the title. Titanic, for instance, we had a pretty good idea the ship was going to sink, even if we didn't know every aspect of the love story. You are the 6th Charter Revision Commission that I've had the opportunity to testify before. Each one of those commissions I've testified to multiple times. Poor Commissioner Fiala has had the dubious distinction of serving on 3 of those commissions, and I thank him especially for his patience. And each commission, I know exactly how it's going to end. I don't know exactly what questions you're going to put on the ballot, but I know it's going to be an incredibly intelligent, incredibly hardworking group of individuals who are really dedicated to the public good, who volunteer of their time to get yelled at by people like me for not doing what we want. And at the end of that, whether it's a 1-year commission or a 2-year commission, you guys are left frustrated, wishing you could have done more, that you could have taken a deeper dive into certain issues. So I'm here tonight to reiterate a suggestion that I made to you in September, which was one of the suggestions that was omitted from the otherwise comprehensive preliminary staff report, which is that you do something which is not without precedent, either in terms of purpose or in terms of structure, and that is you create in the charter, at least give the opportunity to the voters to create, a permanent Charter Revision Council. Mr. Satish Nori is the first person ever to be appointed to a charter commission by a public advocate. Now, that's only because there's nothing in the charter that says that. That's only because the city council deemed it appropriate that the public advocate should have an appointee. Now, what if you were able to continue your work, or have the current public advocate, the current controller, the current speaker of the city council, the borough presidents, the mayor, and maybe even the minority leader of the city council appoint a body like you that can study issues for 2 years. And at the end of 1 year, you make a series of recommendations only on governance issues. You make it to the city council, you make it to the state legislature. And then whatever's not enacted after the second year of your study, you have the ability to put those questions before the voters. We see the public advocate gets to, and other city elected officials I just alluded to, get to make all sorts of appointments, all sorts of different boards, everything from the redistricting committee to the, to the youth board. Why wouldn't we enshrine this in the charter that there's a mechanism? We're not taking anything away from the mayor. We're not taking anything away from the city council. We're just adding a diversity of area of study. Listening to you guys after your last meeting was the most instructive moment of this commission, because I could hear that you wanted to get to more. So get to it. Just give the charter, give the voters the ability to keep going. And then lastly, completely unrelated, the fact that Jumaane Williams, our city's top ranking and only minority citywide elected official, came out in favor of nonpartisan election publicly. I don't know how you don't put that question on the ballot this year. The person he's running against, Joe Borelli, was also elected in a nonpartisan elections just like Jumaane Williams was. The person he beat for that election, Eric Ulrich, was elected to a nonpartisan election just like Jumaane Williams was. The city's first openly gay speaker was elected to her position in a nonpartisan election. We've seen time and time again that nonpartisan elections, especially when coupled with ranked choice voting, give the public and especially underrepresented groups the opportunity to beat back the forces of the political status quo. Why won't you just give the voters the right to choose? Let pro-partisan elections make their argument, and let nonpartisan elections make their argument. Don't take that decision away from the voters. Give it to the voters.
Thank you, Frank. Now, Ralph Biozzo.
Yazzo, I agree with this gentleman. And I just want to speak about, first of all, I want to thank you, the commission, because you actually have a Twitter account, unlike the Property Tax Commission that has absolutely no feedback from the users, and also has promised a report that they haven't produced at all. I don't know what they're doing, and I wish Mr. Albanese would join the Property Tax Commission. I'm going to speak about ranked choice.
Just Mr. Albanese?
Has good taste.
Yes, ranked choice voting, nonpartisan open general election. That, like this gentleman is saying, that what we're talking about is not going far enough. I ask these questions. Why do the taxpayers pay for the Democratic primary? Why? I have no idea. It's their primary. Why shouldn't they pay for it? Let's get rid of primaries, have a general election, nonpartisan. Look at the special election. The U.S. Constitution doesn't talk about political parties at all, so why do we have all these political party influences? Brooklyn is owned by the Brooklyn Democratic Party. We have absolutely no power at all. So every candidate has its own party line. I agree with Mr. Manny and Sal Albanese about democratic vouchers. That just makes sense. And if we want more civic engagement, let's enact resign to run. If you're running for office and you go into your employer or your own business and say, I'm going to run for office and I want to get paid, continue to get paid, they're going to say, thank you, goodbye. But our city council or whatever speaker is running for mayor. They're all running for another office. Jumaane Williams is running for another office as he's a council. Let's get rid of that. Put it in the charter that you can't be running for another office. Why? Can one person do 2 jobs at the same time? No. And also a direct initiative process. I hear all these people coming up here begging the commission to put something on. We should have a direct initiative process, just like most Western states, just like Switzerland, where it's an objective standard where you meet that standard and you get to put things on the ballot. Look at California. I know people might not agree, but propositions, Oregon has ballot measures. It's just ridiculous that New York State, that's an insult to the people that we're too stupid to organize our own government. That doesn't make any sense. I believe that people are intelligent. And so we could get term limits for the governor. That's what we should do. And, but I love the governor. And then another, I always like solutions. So going back to the budget, I want to note that the OMB just runs right out of the door after they testify, right? They should be here. Maybe make them testify last so that they have to stay, right? Because the budget is a mess. We need transparency in the school allocation memorandums for the Department of Education. They have something called Galaxy. We need that in open data. There is something we already pay for. I'll close because I don't want to be rude to other people. But the Department of Finance, the way they put their assessment roll in public is hidden in a zip file inside of a Microsoft Access database. Who even uses Microsoft Access anymore? That's how they publish these things. I've created a website where you can actually see your property tax history. Why is property tax going up at 6%, 8% for Class 2 property? Why? Inflation is near zero, and our property tax is going through the roof. The budget is going up at 5%. What in the world is going on? We have to wake up. And I propose a community budget council so that we have real say on this. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'd just like to ask Sandy, what do you do with the judges? You said that you can't get beyond 3 choices, and most of the time, at least in Brooklyn, when you look at your ballot and there are judges, they're telling you to vote for 10 of them.
Yes, and I never have ever known who those 10 people are and what the differences are between them. I've got, 3 little handout cards that say I worked for such and such a civic organization and I worked at the district attorney's office, and I have no clue what those 10 judges are going to be like on the bench. But
And in the old days with the community
I vote
school
for that,
boards,
so 10 of them
and
have to get selected. So
with the community school boards and the anti-poverty board?
Well, the community school boards are a good example. Back in the 1970s, there were 2 experiments in community control, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Right.
One were the community planning boards, and they were appointed, and they exist to this day, and they play an important role. And then there were community school boards, which were directly elected, and never achieved the dismal 21% turnout that somebody described earlier in the mayoral election. If they got 5% or 7%, that was
They were
enormous.
also in May, not in November, so that's...
They don't get the attention. I mean, there's sort of a generic problem in New York, which is that we have a citywide media, and the citywide media covers sort of the top tier. And it doesn't really pay an enormous amount of attention, with all due respect to the people who serve on the city council, with what they're doing every day. And let alone what the number of candidates might be that are challenging them. And it's very hard for an electorate to be informed about it. I have no problem with 10 people running, but I don't think that people, I think if people are concerned about attracting people to vote, I don't think overwhelming them with, asking them to, it's like getting a survey, and the survey has 50 choices on it. People just stop doing them. And so when you do organize a survey, you have limited answers. By the way, the British, with Brexit, have figured the perfect example of why ranked choice would be, they can't solve a problem because they can't agree amongst 3 or 4 choices, and they're slowly going off a cliff. So clearly there's a role for that, and it's fine to do that in general elections, but keep the, and this is of course not why I came here tonight, but keep the choices to something that attracts people to vote, not something that I think would discourage people from voting.
Are there any other questions for this panel? Yes.
So I'm going to ask a question. I just want to say, Frank, I'm going to look at this material you submitted again and go into a deeper dive with you at a future hearing. But I'm sure I speak for all of my colleagues when I say thank you for your statement that we're dedicated to the public good. I think we all in this room are. We may not all agree on the means, but we're all dedicated to the ends. And I hope, because now you have, I am absolutely certain, being a charter junkie, you have now, you are the person who has testified at more charter meetings than anybody in the history. And I think, I'll tell you something, not that my opinion is worth a damn, But I hope a future mayor or a public advocate or borough president or controller, if there's a future commission like this, you should be sitting here instead of me. I think you've got a breadth and depth and a passion, and I think your voice, I want you to know we're listening. We're listening to all of you, but I appreciate very much that you take the time to show up over and over again.
Thank you, and I'll just add that anybody that saw the marathon 8-hour hearing that you all endured at City Hall, leaving after 2 a.m. for a job that you're not being paid for, nobody can question that you're doing this with the best integrity and the best values, and even if I disagree with your ultimate conclusions, I can't help but admire the work that you've already put into this.
Thank you very much. And now I just want to make an announcement. I had said before we weren't taking any more slips. We are closing the process of accepting any more slips for hearing, but we were going through all the slips that have already been submitted. The next panel is Roxanne Delgado, Andrew Brown, Alex, Kuzemchesko. Is there an Alex here who can tell me how badly I mangled his name?
Really badly.
If you could say it for me, so I...
Alex Kuzemchenko.
Kuzemchiko. Yeah. Okay. Robert DeMello. Is there a Robert DeMello? Okay. Andrew Brown, are you here? No, Andrew Brown is not here. Okay. Laura Domer. No, Laura Thomas, I'm sorry. Okay. Ms. Delgado.
Hi, hello. I'd like to apologize. I didn't have a chance to make any notes. I just found out about this hearing. But I'd like to say first that what happened to of the people, by the people, for the people, because I noticed on the handouts on the desk is about this recommendation of increasing the responsibility or powers of the public advocate. Yet polls after polls, overwhelming the public want to eliminate that office. So I would like to say that if you put that suggestion on the ballot, you should also put the other side of the coin to provide people to eliminate the office of public advocate. And this is nothing against Jamali Williams, it's about the office itself. Second, regarding term limits, I recall I was at your first hearing in the Bronx last year, and I spoke about term limits. I even mentioned something to my former city councilman Vaca, who didn't care much for it, but I still like him. Nonetheless, the issue is that I mentioned that, in my opinion, there's a loophole where those who have been termed out after a brief time, they could return to the same office. And I just found out recently, I read that Gail Brewer, who was a city council member, termed out in 2009 and now is currently BP for Manhattan, is to express her desire to return to her old city council seat. Again, this is against I think the spirit of when people voted for 2 terms for a specific office. I think this should be addressed because otherwise we could continue having people returning to their old seats and basically undermining the opinion or will of the people that they want to change or new blood. So again, I would like to express my support to close what I consider a loophole, which you'd say was not, but a loophole on the 2 4-term limits for each office. Regarding campaign financing, since 2013, I've been testifying in every CFB and voter assistant public hearing about how people continue to say this is the best system in the world or in the nation. I disagree. Why is it not the best system? Because it tends to, and I even know this, Scott Stringer used my testimony in his report. What I mentioned is that it continues to increase the gap between the front runners or the incumbents or the elected officials against the underdogs or challengers or grassroots activists. And you can even see that in this recent public advocate race. The top 7 people were either who hold a current elected position or former elected officials. They were the top 7. The remaining ones that were never held office were in the bottom 5 out of the 17 candidates. So it just shows that not only are we public financing elections that are not competitive, we also tend to fund those who have fundraising ability, which tend to be those who are in elected positions or were in former elected positions. So again, I even said that I even did a spreadsheet for CFB where I did the before. If you didn't publicly finance these races, the gaps was much smaller. But after you publicly finance those races, you actually increase the gap between the incumbent and those who are the unlikely winners or opponent challengers. And lastly, with our RCV, I do have my concerns about that. But if you're going to do it in primary, please do it in the general. I'll discuss that at the Bronx hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You can, if you want to.
Well, basically, my issue with RCV is because of fusion voting. We already have people in my community in the Bronx who have difficulties because they see the same name. Like say with Governor Cuomo, they love him, they vote for him in every party, and then the ballot has to be ripped up, and sometimes they're in frustration. And I only think this will complicate the issue and discourage people from voting. Unless fusion voting is off the table to make this process more complicated. Also, BOE tends to not to be the best. Every time they have something to implement new, it always falls apart. Like the 2-page ballot, it was a disaster. We can have more disruption. It discourages people from voting. We want more people to vote, not less. Thank you again, Chair.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. I'll see you next week.
Yes, definitely.
Alex Kuzinchevsko.
Good evening. We all know New York City has a housing crisis. New York keeps adding jobs, but we haven't built enough housing for a long time. We build less housing per capita than San Francisco. We build 4 times less housing per capita than even Jersey City. While we've heard understandable testimony from groups in neighborhoods experiencing gentrification that want more power over their neighborhood, this power cuts 2 ways. Giving people in rich neighborhoods the ability to prevent rezonings that are right now pushing people out of those neighborhoods into gentrifying neighborhoods. In light of this, any comprehensive plan must take the needs of the entire city and region into account rather than just neighborhood interests, or we will keep getting the same results we have now or worse. As Councilmember Brad Lander testified earlier, neighborhood control through the elected council member has resulted in 90% of rezonings happening in poor neighborhoods. The recommendation to incorporate key indicators into our plan is heartening, and on the topic of specific indicators, I think we should include the market rate price of housing, the amount of housing consumed, as well as commute times in these metrics. But after we have these indicators, we need to ensure that these indicators force action rather than just getting stuck in the same political and legal process we have now where we largely do nothing. In general, we must ensure that the city is zoning for growth to meet the demand from people who would like to live in New York City. Otherwise, the least well-off among us are those who are going to be squeezed the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert DeMello.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the time, and thank you to everybody who's come out and has stayed out through this evening. It's really important to democracy in general, so shout out to everybody in the building. So my name is Robert DeMello, and I'm a volunteer member of Represent Us New York. It's a nonpartisan anti-corruption organization. Sal would be familiar with us. How are you? As I'm sure isn't a surprise, our group supports ranked choice voting. It's numerous benefits, such as no more candidates winning elections with less than half of the people voting for them, saving the city money by avoiding runoff elections, allowing people to vote for their favorite candidate as opposed to the lesser of two evils. I know we've seen a few elections like that in our time. So with that being said, I do want to take a little bit of a way away from the classic, here's a bunch of stats to you, and talk a little bit about the domino effect that was mentioned earlier. Because I think this is an issue that is much bigger than even just New York City. We have an opportunity to be sort of a guiding light in this. So it's no exaggeration to say that our country's democracy is under attack by special interests, dark money, partisan gerrymandering, the list can go on and on. Many of the groups that advocate for ranked choice voting put a lot of resources into curing those problems, and this is identified as a key element in that fight. So by increasing representation and participation, changing the structural incentives for both candidates and voters, we can revitalize our democracy and help protect it from those problems that I mentioned before. But yet ranked choice voting remains sort of in its infancy in terms of adoption in the United States. This body, and therefore this city, has an opportunity to immediately thrust ranked choice voting deep into the national spotlight. This is, again, it's not just improving voting in New York City. It could very well lead to improving the way that many Americans vote in the near future. We've seen it in San Francisco. We've seen it adopted in Maine. It's made some hot headlines, but it's still suffering from a little bit of lack of exposure. So putting the system in place in New York City would immediately more than triple the amount of people using it. It is a vast expansion of the program. What I'm really getting at, it's simple. It's improving the way we do elections in the 5 boroughs could ultimately propel ranked choice voting to widespread adoption. Couple that with the fact that there's already best practices to be taken from the places like San Francisco and Maine that we've mentioned, and it offers us an opportunity to really get it right and not have to be the first ones out the door with it, but also the ones that really propel it onto bigger and bigger stage in general. So at a time where many are worried about our democracy as a whole, let's be the city upon a hill that will inspire New Yorkers to participate more, and then also others around the country to choose a better way of voting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeMello. Ms. Thomas?
Good evening, commissioners. I'm Lauren Thomas, and I'm a resident of Brooklyn. I don't think I need to remind anyone here that New York City has been gripped by an affordable housing crisis exacerbated by the housing shortage that New York has allowed to occur. Since 2009, the city has added over 700,000 jobs and 500,000 people, but only around 135,000 new housing units, many of which have come in the outer boroughs further from the job centers of Midtown and the financial district. This lack of supply and the restrictive zoning laws in much of the city, particularly in desirable neighborhoods near job centers, can be directly traced as the cause of higher rents in the parts of New York City with more affordable housing, like Williamsburg in the early 2000s or Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, and Astoria today. A failure to accommodate growth will not prevent people from moving to New York City, nor should we want to prevent that. Rather, it will only harm the most vulnerable. When young professionals can't move near their jobs because of high rents, they'll move to lower income neighborhoods instead, thus bidding up the price of rent in those neighborhoods. It is imperative that any change to the charter fully recognize the importance of housing not only for those who already live here, but all of those who come to New York City to take advantage of and add to the dynamic nature that makes this city so great. Any comprehensive plan must first and foremost consider the importance of allowing New Yorkers to live where they want to, which, judging by the high land prices in these neighborhoods, are often low-density, centrally located places like Greenwich Village, Soho, the Upper West Side, etc. I'm very concerned that some of the potential tools identified by the Commission to engage the community, like the pre-ULURP certification or a potential comprehensive plan, could be hijacked by politically powerful, wealthy neighborhoods to delay or prevent new housing from ever being built in those neighborhoods. Any delays to ULURP could add a significant cost to those projects, which will be borne by those living in those homes down the road, if the project is even able to be built at all. As Council Member Lander said, 9 of the 10 rezonings in this administration were in low-income neighborhoods. Moreover, I'd like to add that I oppose giving extra time to community boards during this summer. Joining the community board is a privilege that many would love to have, as seen by the 5-fold increase in community board applications this past cycle, or so I've heard. And members make a commitment when they join these boards. They should be able to make a once-a-month meeting, twice if they're on the subcommittee for land use, to discuss any LURP applications before the community board. I believe this may also be used as a delaying tactic to prevent housing, which again does have real human costs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your staying. The next panel will be Andrew Hess. Are you here? Yeah. Okay. Nestor Davidson. Nestor, are you here? Okay. Marion Ewan. Marion. Amy Platzmeyer. Amy Platzmeyer? No. Betty Davis? Step right up. Mr. Hess.
Okay. Thank you very much to the Commission for the opportunity to testify. My name is Andrew Hess, and I'm a 4th-generation New Yorker. And I'm here to speak today in favor of ranked choice voting, with the hope that the city's Charter Revision Commission will recommend its adoption in the future. I'll start by talking about a larger general election and then talk about why the same principle applies to city primaries and special elections. We saw the concept of voting for the lesser of two evils or voting strategically, namely in the 2016 presidential election. We heard a lot of talking heads on TV talking about it all the time. We see this happen where a voter's favored candidate is not one of the top two vote getters, and so they have to either vote for one of those two top candidates or their vote might be wasted. In this election, people would have to hold their nose and pick one of the top two. And this election is a clear example of voters not being able to vote their conscience for the fear that the worst of the top two candidates would win. It would play spoiler. Ironically, in any election, the prevalence of this view makes it nearly certain that one of these top two candidates will win. And the same principle applies in this city. Voters should be able to vote their conscience without fearing that their least preferred candidate will win due to these wasted votes. Ranked choice voting would allow voters to register their preferences beyond their top choice, permitting voters to both vote strategically and vote their conscience. Another issue is runoffs. Just for an example, in the 2013 Democratic primary election for public advocate, 18.5% of eligible voters turned out. And Letitia James and Daniel Squadron were the top two vote getters, but neither one crossed the 40% threshold necessary to avoid a runoff. So they go to the runoff about a month later, and Letitia James wins by 18 percentage points, but turnout dropped from 18.5% to 6.9%. Such low turnout can result in a future lack of faith in our elections and can also reduce the mandate given to an elected official by the voters. How does that voter know that they're really representing the people who they're supposed to represent if only less than 7% of people voted in those elections? Ranked choice voting would solve this issue of low turnout in runoffs by allowing voters to rank the remaining candidates, thereby allowing runoffs to occur automatically if nobody reaches the 40% threshold. Now, besides the earlier view against ranked choice voting where voters might get confused, I'm not going to focus on that. Another opposing viewpoint that I had heard against ranked choice voting is that voters would rather know the top two vote getters before making the decision between them, and ranked choice voting would take that decision out of their hands. Now, this might seem fair on its surface, but ranked choice voting reveals a voter's relative preferences as well as their absolute preferences. It's not just who their top choice is, it's how each candidate ranks in relation to all of the other candidates. And so all possible runoff matchups are accounted for when all the candidates are ranked. And so this problem is somewhat mitigated by design and has the added benefit of not needing to hold another election, which will inevitably reduce turnout. And so I hope that the Charter Revision Commission will consider adopting ranked choice voting for city primaries and special elections and eventually go a step further, if not in this particular review, and adopt ranked choice voting for all city elections. Allowing voters to express their opinions and desires more fully will lead to a better functioning democratic system. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hess. Mr. Davidson?
Thank you so much. And I want to echo the comments of earlier speakers who commended the commission as we head past my bedtime. It's remarkable the work you've all put in on this. My name is Nestor Davidson. I hold the Albert A. Walsh Chair in Real Estate, Land Use, and Property Law at Fordham Law School. I'm also a member of the New York City Bar Charter Revision Task Force, although I'm here entirely in my capacity as a proud Brooklyn resident tonight. What I want to speak very briefly to is the question of comprehensive planning. As I read the staff report, it recommends coordination and adding objective benchmarks and consistency across the dozen or so existing plans we have. And I think that's a commendable first step, although I'd make one small technical recommendation, which is the staff report talks about tying time horizons to terms. And I think there's something to be said, even if the timing...
Could you speak into the mic, please?
Sorry, how's that?
That's better.
Okay. Speaking just in terms of short, medium, and long term, not tying that so much to the electoral cycle, there are certain plans that might need to have a different cycle. And as we think about syncing those up, elective terms might not be the right framework. I do applaud the staff's recommendation as a first step. I do want to make a couple of suggestions. First, even if there isn't a new comprehensive plan, I think that any articulation of goals that would combine and sort of bind all of these plans together should have clear, common, citywide objectives. so that in that balance between the incredible value of community input and the need to recognize citywide goals, we have a benchmark that is citywide. It's much easier to determine that you have or have not changed a community, but it's much harder to keep track of what is happening on a citywide basis, and those are very difficult trade-offs. I also want to say that I think it's really critical, and we've had several speakers this evening talk to this, I think, eloquently, that as we think about the goals, I think it's important to balance community needs and stakeholder engagement, but also make sure that whatever system we create does ensure that we can meet the demand that we have and meet the need for housing growth. And I think there are some positive things to be said about the current system. There are obviously areas for reform, but I think it is clear that we are not meeting housing demand. And for those of us who are concerned about equity and inclusion, I think other speakers have spoken eloquently to why there is a ripple effect, and that if we cannot ensure housing, sufficient housing stock across the city, and not just in low-income communities of color, there is a spillover effect, there's a ripple effect, and that's exactly what a citywide view should be able to help us understand. Obviously, planning carries risks, and other experts have testified to some of those risks, but I encourage the commission, as you think about your work, to take all of the great work you've done so far and keep this conversation going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davidson. Ms. Yoon, or Yuen?
Good evening. Thank you for holding this hearing. My name is Marian Yuen. I live in Midwood, right here in Brooklyn. I'm a licensed real estate broker and a green infrastructure professional. Last year, I submitted some input for y'all to urge the commission to take on nature as our friend and partner. Today, we're in 2019, and scientists tell us that there are about 12 years before our planet's climate would very likely cross an irreversible threshold. This commission has the unique opportunity to see all its work, not just the land use matters, in the context of environmental degradation and global climate change. You have the historic responsibility to recommend a 2019 version of the Charter of the Forest. As you all know, in the year 1217, the English Charter of the Forest was confirmed as a complement to the Magna Carta, and a lot of American law is descended from that kind of law. The City Council's Intro 1399 to create a Department of Sustainability and Climate Change is a wonderful start. At the same time, the totality of this year's charter revisions needs to be seen in the context of the existential challenges that irreversible global climate degradation and climate change bring right up to our faces. Last week at a town hall, a well-intentioned and highly regarded elected official in this town promised to fight till climate change is no more. Now, such formulation is based on really a mistaken understanding that climate change is something or some guy that we could beat up if we just worked hard enough. Really, a changing climate is part of nature, but human actions have pushed our planet's climate out of balance to a runaway pace. Legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions might slow down the pace of this change a bit. As we approach the irreversible threshold, we find that more and more aspects of our lives are impacted by the rapid climate changes, including public health and increasing inequity. It is impossible to predefine which and how our municipal services would be disrupted. Therefore, I urge the Commission to adopt addressing climate change and restoring our city's relationship with nature as the rubric, the headline of this year's charter revision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yoon. Ms. Davis?
First of all, thank you for allowing me to speak. As always, I'm juggling several balls, and I'm always late to every meeting that I go to. And finally, I think we ought
elected
to...
official?
I think we ought to mandate that when people come up to this panel, we all stay to hear what each has to say and listen and interact with each other. But having said that, I appreciate they may have had another meeting to go to. And I want to thank everyone that was here. It gives me hope in terms of humanity. And as someone who just turned 75, I have lost most of my hope in humanity watching this country descend into barbarism. But I will start with my last colleague, and what I want to speak to, because a dear friend asked me not to give up, but to come and speak, and she couldn't be here, and that's Connie. She wanted me to speak on behalf of the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens and keeping them accessible for people who do not make, 9-figure salaries. So one of the things I wanted to speak to is that public space is disappearing, and the less economically fortunate have few, if any, alternatives. The least a decent society that calls itself progressive can do is to make accessible the public space that is left, and make it accessible to those who are less fortunate. And lastly, and within this paragraph, I would like to say to you, remember, education and culture has its own dividends. And allegedly within a democracy, these values are supposedly important. And I'd like to then reference what the young man to my far right was speaking about in terms of ranked voting. When people feel that no matter who they vote for, the outcome will be the same, they're not going to come for community board meetings. They're not going to come for any of your other meetings. Then when they finally think they have a candidate that makes a difference, and 300,000 votes suddenly disappear, and nothing is done, and no one is held accountable for the fact that all of a sudden 300,000 New Yorkers lost their votes, just disappeared because they had the nerve to vote for Bernie Sanders. I mean, this does not lead to trust. And I was raised to believe that you have good government when the government fears the people and not the other way around. But apparently the government fears us so much that no matter who we vote for, our voices do not count. Finally, I would like to say in terms of having public space, the warehousing in New York City with regard to NYCHA is clear to everybody. Everybody knows about it. You don't have a housing shortage. You really don't. If you enforced your own laws with regard to the real estate people and made them pay their taxes, but then again, you can't make the president pay his taxes. So why shouldn't you give the real estate people a 10-year break on paying their taxes? If they didn't get that 10-year break, you could afford more income, affordable housing in New York. So I've come to the conclusion, and I know I'm running over, that we need to study history. And that's my last comment in terms of a police review board. The origin of the police in New York City is that it's based on the fact that New York City was either the #1 or the second largest slave state in this country. The police are not police. They are slave catchers. That is how they originated. You cannot expect a slave catcher to have compassion for people they still consider slaves. So until we have a decent society and have decent schools and have decent parks, you can't expect the police to be decent. They don't come from that in this culture. And within the concept of public space, I don't see why we can't keep our public schools, especially PS 125 that did everything right, and now you're letting a charter school take it over. So you're letting the corporations have our housing. You're letting the corporations have our schools. You're letting the corporations and the rich have our parks. And then you wonder why people don't like the police and don't like rich people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for this panel? Thank you very much for staying and for sharing your thoughts with us. We do appreciate it, even if we seem a little tired. The last two slips I have are Ken T. from Open New York and Stephanie Zinnerman. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think you guys might recognize me from Tuesday night. I made it all the way out to Queens, but I live right here in downtown Brooklyn. So I commuted to my hometown. I won't say hometown, but my town since 2011. I'm still advocating for comprehensive planning, and my friends, Stephen, Alex, Lauren, and the lawyer who just spoke, I agree with all of them.
Can I just ask you, you signed in on Tuesday as Ken A.
So you called me Mr. A, and I was really hoping that you would call me Mr. T, so I can say I pity the fool that doesn't support more housing. But you know, you didn't ruin the joke for me. So I was really hoping that you would call me Mr. T. But yes, it is Ken A. I'm surprised you remember me. So anyhow, I'm glad that you remember me and you remember what I said. I just want to give a personal story since I've been living in the area since 2011. And the reason why I'm advocating for more supply and comprehensive planning that produces enough supply for the demand in the neighborhood. I used to live in Dumbo. I got really lucky and I just found an amazing deal in Dumbo, which I still can't believe I got that, but eventually my rent went up. So I had to move out. And then I ended up in Brooklyn Heights, 75 Pineapple Street. And then the landlord tried to raise my rent again. But luckily, my timing couldn't be perfect for my end because a lot of new supply came in downtown Brooklyn. And I was able to not only negotiate a rent decrease because of that new supply and all that new competition on the market, the rent in my new unit is now cheaper than even the rent after the decrease in my old unit. And it's a newer, nicer building too. So this is why having a comprehensive plan that is creating enough supply and has enough teeth to create that supply is extremely important to New Yorkers like myself. On a side note, outside of my group, Open New York, I do want to agree with everybody who came here about the Citizen Review Board on the police. I think that is extremely important. I wasn't aware of that issue until I started attending these meetings, but I agree with them wholeheartedly. My girlfriend's African American slash Latina. Actually, I'm Latino myself, even though I don't look it. But I know that she may be treated differently than I would be just because of how I look. So I think having a citizen review board is important. Happy to take any questions. My timing is perfect.
Finished under time. Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Ms. Zinnerman.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Zinnerman, and I serve as chair for the Civic Engagement Committee for the Brooklyn NAACP. As you're aware, the NAACP is the oldest and the boldest civil rights organization in the nation. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the CCRB as well as the public advocate position and the Department of Investigation. I want to talk a little bit about the midterm elections. I happen to live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I'm a third-generation Bedford-Stuyvesant resident. And there were a number of us that were dismayed, and we decided that we were going to sit down and look at what happened during that election and specifically how did the three proposals pass that we were adamantly against. So during those discussions, of course, we came across what was going to be happening here today and submitted a proposal to have the CCRB and the Department of Investigation under the auspices of the public advocate. I applaud the fact that everybody believes that the public advocate is a check and balance to the mayor. I absolutely believe that we need that check and balance. But sometimes we get lost in acronyms. So CCRB and DOI, and people do not remember why those agencies were created. Now, I happen to live in the neighborhood where I am a friend of the police. I'm a card-carrying member of the police department in my card, in my wallet. I have friends at the 77th, the 79, and the 81st. However, and I'm going to go back to the statements made by Betty Davis, that we absolutely need these agencies, and we need these agencies to be independent. And I do not believe giving just 2 seats, the public advocate, the ability to appoint just 2 members is going to provide the protections that people need. We have a problem in our agencies across the board in terms of cultural competency. And of course, we've all seen racism take front and center stage in the last couple of years. Well, let's be truthful, since President Obama was elected. And because we cannot erase that every day, we have to have in protections. So I really wish that you would consider strongly giving the CCRB and the Department of Investigations over to the public advocate, which would strengthen that office, give it more teeth, and be a bit more independent than it is right now. And finally, I don't know how much time we have, but I do want to say something about term limits. I believe in institutional memory. I'm also a longtime advocate. I know how to get people elected. And I think that if you want to get someone out of office, you just have to do the work to get them out of office and not term limit. And when we get to the point that we actually term limit volunteers, when the people who appoint them are already term limited, I don't know where we've come as a country. We have to get in the street, talk to our neighbors, do the work, and then we can get our elected officials. We've seen it election after election. Yes, we've seen some bad elections, but we've seen what can happen when people get together and decide that they don't want someone in office anymore. Thank you very much for the time to speak.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I just have one question for you.
Yes.
You were not here.
Oh, no, I was not.
Jim? I'm going to ask mine first.
Sure.
You weren't here when, I don't believe, when Public Advocate Williams was here.
No, I wasn't.
But he was interested in the proposal for the CCRB, but he was not interested in having jurisdiction over DOI.
Did he say why? I'm going to have to roll by there and have a conversation
Yeah, you may
with
want
him.
to talk to him.
Yes, I will. Okay.
Jim?
Tell him he just has to hire some more people. He can get it done.
I wanted to thank you for your testimony. On a theoretical level, I just want to say I agree with a lot of what you said. I think some of the changes are in the time we have left are probably too large to consider. You know, when we started here, I had, in my head, maybe we should have, the public advocate should be an elected sort of legal officer for the city. And that sort of goes along with some of what you're saying. I do have a question off your testimony.
Okay.
Does the NAACP have a position on ranked choice voting?
Yes, and you will be hearing about that soon, but I'm going to let Madam Dukes have that conversation with you.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Already. But I do want to say that I was the director of an adult literacy program for about 14 years, and we have, I think we're still about 16% of our adult population have literacy issues. So having said, I'm going to put a pin in that.
Thank you.
Okay.
You are clearly not one of them.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone who came out today, whether you spoke, whether you listened, whether you had some ideas and may
call us or go on our website or tweet at us. We really appreciate all of your participation, and we want to thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, we can open the floor for discussion, although I have a sense that it might be best if we do that at our next meeting. If that is the will of the commissioners who are here, I would close the meeting. Are there any objections?
None.
The meeting is closed. Thank you very much.